There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
From 1959 to 1964, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone gave television audiences 5 seasons of stories that captured their attention and resonated with their imaginations. Its tales of the odd, peculiar, and downright strange always had at least a thread of humanity for us to connect to, often using those strange situations to highlight more important issues, dealing with social commentary, cautionary tales, or the true nature of what it means to be human. The legacy of this sci-fi anthology series is one that has more than stood the test of time. Over 60 years later, The Twilight Zone continues to inspire viewers both young and old. Throughout the generations that have followed, we've seen countless multimedia adaptations, including a feature film and 3 separate television reboots. The latest one, narrated by Jordan Peele, just released their 2nd season this past June. This October, I'll be reviewing the first 31 episodes of the original series. That's 1 video per day, all month long. We'll also dive into some behind-the-scenes information made available in Mark Zicree's The Twilight Zone companion book. So make sure you tune in as we go on this journey together into the Twilight-Tober Zone. Where Is Everybody is the very first episode of The Twilight Zone. It aired on October 2nd, 1959, and impressed the bigwigs enough for a full season to be ordered. The pilot version that was only shown to sponsors and executives featured Westbrook Van Voorhees doing the narration. He was replaced by series creator Rod Serling himself after other options were considered, including, most notably, Orson Welles. A different title sequence was also created by the time the episode made it to air. Rod Serling originally had another story in mind for the pilot called The Happy Place, but it was rejected for fears it would scare off advertisers. In that script, the narrative took place in a society where people who made it to the age of 60 were executed for no longer being useful. Where Is Everybody was definitely a safer route to go down, as there wasn't anything quite so shocking. It follows a man with amnesia entering a small town that looks to be inhabited. Music is playing, shops are open, and even food sits out ready to be consumed. But it's empty. Slowly, the man starts to remember details about who he is, but it may not be enough to save him from his desperate isolation and feeling of being watched. This was definitely a solid start to the series. The creepy tone of the whole episode sticks with you, and that fear of isolation is something that most of us can relate to in some way. All that is exemplified by the beautiful sets, lighting, and camera work, especially towards the end when the sun goes down. The shots they went with here look phenomenal. The slanted Dutch angles, in combination with the trademark black and white aesthetic, came together to create some fantastic visuals. The town square itself was shot on the Universal Studios lot. You may recognize it from a famous movie that came out a few decades later. I had my suspicions about that upon this latest rewatch, and it was confirmed in several of the commentary tracks on the Blu-ray. The strengths of this episode are definitely the visuals and overall atmosphere. What don't hold up quite so well are the dialogue and some of the line delivery. These two problems go hand in hand as Earl Holliman, the lead actor, has no one to bounce his dialogue off of. Rod Serling himself would later admit that the constant monologuing he wrote wasn't believable enough in the scenario he created. I agree 100%, as we all know film is a visual medium. The same emotions could have been conveyed more effectively with minimal lines from Holliman, as the wonderfully composed shots tell the story. There are moments here where he's talking to himself that really don't work.
Look, I don't want you to think I'm nuts or anything. It's nothing like that. It's just that I don't seem to remember who I am.
I mean, that's quite clearly a mannequin. Holliman has his own commentary track on the Blu-ray where he mentions the same problem. He also criticizes some of his acting, wishing he could have gotten some more direction and done a few scenes over. I agree that some of the delivery could have been improved, but the main culprit was that there was just too much talking from his character, a flaw that Serling pointed out years later. Holliman was also sick with a fever while shooting the episode, which could have affected his performance. When the man starts to give in to his paranoia, repeatedly shouting for help, it's revealed that the man's name is Mike Ferris, an astronaut trainee. He's been in isolation for 2.5 weeks in preparation for a solo voyage to the moon. The empty town he thought himself to be in was a hallucination brought about by intense, prolonged sensory deprivation, as the containment unit he was in was only 5 foot square. This is all explained in detail at the end, which seems a little unnecessary, but apparently part of why those lines were there was to have a more straightforward ending to satisfy the network and sponsors. So overall, Where Is Everybody is a good start to the Twilight Zone. I wouldn't rank it as one of the best episodes, but it's certainly not one of the worst, and it did its job, getting the series picked up so we can have more strange and better executed episodes. Its themes, visuals, and tone are quite exceptional. I'd recommend it as a piece of television history. One for the Angels was the second Twilight Zone episode aired, and had a very different tone from the pilot, Where Is Everybody? Rod Serling based the episode off an old teleplay he did with the same title that aired on the TV show Danger in 1954. He specifically wrote the new version for the star of the episode, Ed Wynn. You may recognize Wynn from his many Disney appearances in the 1950s and 60s, including Babes in Toyland, Mary Poppins, and voicing the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. Serling and Wynn had previously worked together on the television version of Requiem for a Heavyweight in 1956, and would do one more Twilight Zone episode together a few years later. This trip into the fifth dimension followed a sidewalk pitchman named Lou Bookman. He's well liked by his neighborhood and a favorite of the local children. When a man dressed in black named Mr. Death informs Bookman that his time on this earth is up at midnight, he bargains to stay a bit longer so he can make his greatest sales pitch, one for the angels, as he calls it. Looking to take advantage of Death's generosity, he plans on skipping town and never pitching again. Because of this, Mr. Death mentions that he'll have to devise an alternative solution. This is definitely a less serious episode of The Twilight Zone. It has a bit more whimsy than most of the popular episodes the series is known for, but that's not a bad thing in this case. Ed Wynn drives this bittersweet story as his unique charisma makes it a pleasant watch. It has gotten some criticism over the years for Wynn not being fit to portray a fast-talking street pitchman, as was the stereotype. I will say, the scene where he's pitching to Mr. Death doesn't quite land. There seems to be a disconnect from the script, direction, and Mr. Death's reaction to how Wynn portrays Bookman. I know how it was supposed to come off, but because Wynn was most certainly not a fast talker, the scene comes off a bit awkward. And that's not a knock on the performance, it just seems that maybe someone should have called an audible and reworked that scene from a slightly different angle. Speaking of the performances, Murray Hamilton plays Mr. Death here as a procedural tax collector. His intro is pretty great.
Mr. Death.
Murray Hamilton had a long career, but many people know him best as the mayor from Jaws.
Love to prove that, wouldn't you? Get your name into the National Geographic.
His portrayal of Mr. Death is well done and very straightforward. He's shown as just your average, everyday supernatural entity doing his job. Rod Serling wrote this character very differently from most of the other versions that were seen prior. Honestly, Serling could have just played the role himself. Mr. Death has the same look, attitude, and cadence of the narrator, which, at this point, had not yet shown up on camera. Because Bookman fools Death into giving him more time on Earth, the Stoic Reaper mentions he'll have to take a replacement. That replacement is a little neighborhood girl Bookman is familiar with named Maggie. She's hit by a car, and Mr. Death says he'll be back to collect her soul at midnight. The lighting change that signifies she can now see him where she couldn't previously is a nice little effective detail. Bookman waits outside Maggie's home in an effort to stop Death, which is where his pitch comes in to distract him from getting to her. Mr. Death misses his midnight appointment, and with Bookman giving his proverbial pitch to the angels, they walk off together to the great unknown, but not before a particularly sweet exchange.
You never know who might need something up there. Up there?
Up there, Mr. Bookman. You made it.
I really love this ending. Wynn is so likable as Bookman that I was rooting for him to somehow cheat Death, but his self-sacrifice to save his little friend is the perfect ending to a story like this. That bittersweet nature is what makes it stand out from the pack. All in all, it's definitely a recommendation from me for what makes it different, yet it still fits nicely into the series. A reminder that our time here is finite, and an optimistic wish that everyone should be so lucky to have a full life and grow old. A reminder and a wish that forever live inside the Twilight Zone. Mr. Denton on Doomsday is the first Twilight Zone episode that utilized the Old West setting. Westerns were very popular at the time, both on TV and in theaters, so it's no wonder that we got to see one here. It's also notable for featuring a young Martin Landau as the town bully who loves to humiliate our main character. Originally, Rod Serling had a different angle on the story. It was to be called You Too Can Be a Fast Gun, about a school teacher who longed to be a gunslinger and was granted that ability by a magic potion. Serling decided he wanted to do something less superficial, and we ended up with a very different and more nuanced tale. Al Denton was once the fastest gun in town. Men would ride in from all over to face off against him, and he never lost. But that was years ago. Denton is now the town drunk, who regularly embarrasses himself just to get another drink. But that all changes when a gun mysteriously appears next to him in the street. Suddenly, Denton seems to have his skills back, and a traveling salesman named Henry J. Fate looks to be the cause of it all. Word quickly gets around about Denton's return to form, and he's challenged by a young outsider looking to make a name for himself. Fate then steps in again with an offer the aging gunfighter has to consider. This is a very thoughtful and character-driven episode. Dan Duryea plays Al Denton with a regretful demeanor as we hear about the cause of his alcoholism. He killed so many people during his time as a gunfighter that it weighed heavy on him. The last one he killed sent him directly into a downward spiral.
The guy who asked me to prove it turned out to be 16 years old. I left him there bleeding to death with my bullet in him. I guess it'll start all over again now.
It's a shame that scene's on-set audio was somehow unusable, as it's clearly ADR'd. Some of the inflections and tone of voice Duryea was using just before this is missing, and it slightly affects the performance in this very important sequence. Otherwise though, Duryea is a very believable, likable, and sympathetic lead actor. The Denton character was well written, with a backstory that could have filled up a feature film. Martin Landau is well cast as the sadistic local antagonist to Denton. He really pulls off the mean-spiritedness required to get pleasure out of making an alcoholic sing for his next drink.
Let's see you pay for your drink. In your own inimitable fashion, huh? A song, Denton.
Landau would later return to the Twilight Zone in the Season 5 episode, The Jeopardy Room. He has a commentary track on the Blu-ray for this Season 1 appearance where he praises the series and Rod Serling in general. They worked together several times, and Landau considered him a friend. The subtle supernatural spin Serling places into the script is what makes this work as both a Twilight Zone episode and almost a pure Western. Honestly, the character work overshadows any turn the story took. After Denton is challenged to another gunfight, he realizes all his old skill really is gone. About to skip town, he runs into the salesman Henry J. Fate, who gives him an elixir that provides him with a perfect shot for 10 seconds. This character is positioned as trying to help Denton, but some of his delivery suggests he's more of a deal with the devil type.
Go ahead. Drink it. Go ahead. Draw on it. Draw on it.
When Denton meets the young Pete Grant, we see that he has the same elixir, and they fire to a draw, permanently injuring both their shooting hands. The ending narration suggests that fate saved them both. It pulled one out of a pit and saved the other from falling in. This was a nice story about redemption and correcting the mistakes of the past. It's not one of my top-tier episodes, but it's an engaging watch. Again, I think its strongest attributes were the character work and acting. However, director Alan Reisner helmed a great ship here. This was his only episode of the series, but he did direct The Time Element from 1958, an episode of Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse that Serling wrote, which started the ball rolling on getting the Twilight Zone started. If you like the Western setting or introspective character pieces, I think Mr. Denton on Doomsday may just be your cup of tea. A tea only brewed in the Twilight Zone. The 16mm shrine often gets compared to the 1950 film Sunset Boulevard. When I first saw it, I thought the same. They share the premise of an aging actress from another era living in a conceited haze of denial, but where the stories go are slightly different. This is the Twilight Zone after all. Coincidentally, both projects also had the same music composer, Franz Waxman. The star of this episode, Ida Lupino, later returned to the show to direct the season 5 episode Masks. She was not only the lone female director of a Twilight Zone episode, but also the only actor who directed a separate installment. The director of the 16mm Shrine, Mitchell Leisen, also helmed many films in the 30s, and was said to have connected with the material very well. This was one of 3 episodes that Leisen directed, and the first to air. Barbara Jean Trenton was a huge film star in the 1930s. However, now in the late 50s, her star has faded, and those movie roles have all dried up. She secludes herself in a screening room inside her home where the aging actress constantly watches her old films on repeat and longs for the days when she was on top. Her agent, Danny, continuously tries to get her back out into the world and work again. He sets up a meeting for a potential new acting role and even invites one of her old co-stars to her house. But Barbara rejects these gestures and rededicates herself to her old routine of seclusion and nostalgia. This time with a very Twilight Zone-esque twist. I like the idea of this episode quite a bit. You could kind of see where it was going with little clues dropped here and there, but predictability isn't a bad thing if it makes sense within the story being told. What works best about this are the character interactions, mostly between Barbara and Danny. Danny is such a nice guy and genuinely trying to help his client. Also, like Sunset Boulevard, there's a bit of an insinuation that there may be some more romantic feelings on one or both sides.
You're a nice guy and a loyal friend. And in my selfish, devious way, I'm very much in love with you.
Martin Balsam has a very recognizable face, since he was in so many seminal movies around the same time, including 12 Angry Men, Psycho, On the Waterfront, and many more. He also made one other Zone appearance in Season 4. He played a range of characters in his long career and comes off very sincere in Danny's attempts to aid Barbara.
That room across the hall is dark, it's damp, it's full of cobwebs. Now, come on, honey, snap out of it, snap out of this kick.
Lupino beautifully plays a woman once treated like a queen who's been forgotten by the public. Now this brings up all kinds of themes and issues. It's no Hollywood secret that parts for actresses in their 40s aren't as plentiful as parts in their 20s. It's a problem that's been brought up much more in recent years, and back then, this was of course even more prominent. Outside of that, the vain attitude she exhibits is a byproduct of her immense fame all those years prior. She refuses to accept a lesser role in a scene that's a bit brutal to listen to, but effective nonetheless.
I don't play mothers, Mr. Saul. I never have, and I won't start now.
You're just an aging broad with a scrapbook.
Look, Marty.
And any part you get at this studio will be charity.
Ouch. While it's somewhat understandable, Barbara can't move on. She's stuck in the past and fails to move forward with her life. From here, she gets more delusional and doubles down on her isolation. Even a visit from an old co-star makes her even further withdrawn. This all leads to an intriguing twist. After going back to her screening room, her maid enters to see she's gone. She then screams upon looking at the screen. When Danny is called over, he turns on the projector to see Barbara and all her old co-stars together inside her house. Aside from Barbara, they all look as they did in their films and are having the party she mentioned earlier. As Danny calls for her to come back, she bids him farewell and drops her scarf on the floor. The film runs out, and upon entering the actual part of the house that was seen on the screen, Danny finds her scarf on the floor.
To wishes, Barbie. To the ones that come true.
Her wish to get exactly what she wanted happened. It's a creepy ending, showing that when someone lives in the past for too long, they won't have a future. It's grim for most of us, but also exactly what Barbara was wishing for, so is this a happy ending? I don't know. I don't consider it one myself, but what do you think? The 16mm Shrine is a very strong early episode of the show. This is one I would definitely give a rewatch to for its somewhat unsettling visuals, ideas, ending, performances, and multiple social themes. Walking Distance is one of my favorite episodes of The Twilight Zone. It's the first one I really connected to personally, and I'm not alone. It's one of the most revered installments of the whole series. I'll say right away, it's a strong recommendation from me. Initially, this was one of Rod Serling's favorite episodes too, but on the Blu-ray, there's audio from a lecture he gave in 1975 where he criticizes his script structure and some of the main characters' dialogue. Regardless, it's notable for, in my opinion, some very heartfelt and poignant writing, amazing direction from Robert Stevens, incredible visuals from cinematographer George T. Clemens, top-notch acting from Gig Young, and a superb score from Bernard Herrmann. There are lots of interesting little tidbits that go along with the production, like how it features an appearance from a very young Ron Howard, or how the neighborhood scenes were shot on the set built for the 1944 Judy Garland movie Meet Me in St. Louis. But as for this episode's contents, the story of our main character's journey into the past is what makes it a true television classic. Martin Sloan is a New Yorker who works for an ad agency. Burnt out by his demanding job, he visits his old hometown, aptly named Homewood. It looks like things haven't changed a bit, so much so that Martin slowly discovers everything is a little too similar to how he remembers it when he was a child, to the point where he visits his old house and sees that his deceased parents are alive, looking as they did when he was young. There's even a boy named Marty Sloan roaming around the neighborhood who looks exactly as Martin did when he was 11 years old. Sloan truly seems to be back in time, but the purpose of this predicament is something he'll have to look deep within himself to find. There's so much to praise about Walking Distance. It's one of those examples where every aspect of filmmaking came together to make a real gem. Serling's writing came from a deeply personal place, and that's evident from his narration and character dialogue. Cinematographer George T. Clemens brought us some of the best-looking camera work of the series. These shots are gorgeous. When Martin starts walking to Homewood, the camera pushes in on a mirror showing him walk away. The following shot sees Sloan entering Homewood's drugstore. After a moment, we watch the shot pull out of another mirror. This visually suggests Martin has entered a peculiar situation. Later, when Martin searches for his younger self at the merry-go-round, the angles are canted as things get more intense. That scene reminds me of one of my favorite Hitchcock movies, Strangers on a Train. That film beautifully utilized a carnival-type setting for its climax. The visuals go even further later in this scene when the dreamlike quality of the episode picks up. Martin walks past the children as the lighting dramatically shifts for a beautiful moment of melancholy sincerity. As the kids move past him, the camera pushes back, perhaps representing how the joy of childhood has left him behind. The strategic use of close-ups throughout the runtime also contributes to that dreamlike nostalgic aura that permeates Walking Distance. Bernard Herrmann was a music legend in the film and television business. His credits include Citizen Kane, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, Taxi Driver, and so much more. He composed the music for 7 Twilight Zone episodes, plus the original intro and credits to the show. Walking Distance may very well be his best work for the series. If you get a chance, track down the music and listen to how the strings bring about a feeling of wistful longing and a twist of the mysteriously bizarre. After directing the pilot for this series, Where Is Everybody?, Robert Stevens returned for Walking Distance, but because he went over time and budget, he wasn't brought back. That was very unfortunate. His 2 episodes were strong early installments, and this one is commonly called one of the show's very best. He seemed to really understand Rod's script in a way that elevated it to another level. It's just too bad he didn't have the chance to bring more of Serling's stories to life. Academy Award winner Gig Young plays Martin Sloan with a confused yearning that's tough to balance. You really buy into his idyllic memories of Homewood. Seeing him describe them as he slowly figures out what's happening presents a shift in his attitude that was believable and empathetic. Watching him try to convince his parents that he's the adult version of their young son is a tragic scene.
Where is Martin?
I'm Martin! You've got to believe me, I'm Martin! You've got to believe me!
While that scene is powerful, it's pretty quick. The best one comes at the end. Martin tries for a second time to talk to his younger self, but instead frightens him off the merry-go-round, permanently injuring his leg. At that same moment, adult Martin feels the pain of his past self and now has a limp. After young Marty is taken away to a doctor, it sinks in that Martin's remorse and longing for the past has begun to physically hurt him.
Won't be any more merry-go-rounds. No more cotton candy. No more band concerts.
Martin's father shows up, believing his story after reading through some of the younger Sloane's ID cards and seeing the date on them. This is an incredible sequence. The writing, acting, and music fill you with emotion. It's a magnificent exchange.
You have to leave here. That little boy, the one who belongs here, this is his summer, just as it was yours once.
Martin's father gives him a piece of advice that he clearly never got originally. It may be cheesy, but in the context of the episode, it's perfect.
You've been looking behind you, Martin. Try looking ahead. Goodbye, son.
Goodbye, Pop.
Martin then jumps on the merry-go-round and we transition back to 1959 with a nice match cut of a record player. Martin is still in Homewood but now has a limp. It's suggested that he always had it, which means he changed his own past. However, Sloane doesn't seem to remember his strange ordeal. He gets back to his car with a refreshed, positive attitude. Then we hear possibly Rod Serling's best closing narration. It's too long to play the full clip, but I'll read it here. Martin Sloane, age 36. Vice President in charge of media. Successful in most things, but not in the one effort that all men try at some time in their lives. Trying to go home again. And also, like all men, perhaps there'll be an occasion, maybe a summer night sometime, when he'll look up from what he's doing and listen to the distant music of a calliope, and hear the voices and the laughter of the people and the places of his past. And perhaps across his mind there'll flint a little errant wish that a man might not have to become old, never outgrow the parks and the merry-go-rounds of his youth. And he'll smile then too, because he'll know it is just an errant wish, some wisp of memory not too important really.
Some laughing ghosts that cross a man's mind, that are a part of the Twilight Zone.
Escape Clause was the 6th episode aired, but one of the very first produced in Season 1's production cycle. It features our first Deal with the Devil story, a trope that would pop up a few more times throughout the series. This installment spotlights performances from David Wayne and Thomas Gomez, and was directed by Mitchell Leisen. It was Leisen's second episode to air following the 16mm Shrine. His third and final we'll talk about a little later this month. Walter Bedecker is a grumpy, selfish hypochondriac who is all too aware of mortals' short time on Earth. Wishing he had many more years to live, a man named Mr. Cadwallader appears in his room and makes Bedecker an offer. In exchange for his soul, Cadwallader can guarantee Bedecker immortality, indestructibility, and the gift of not physically aging any further. Also built into their contract is an escape clause, in which, if Bedecker ever gets tired of living, Cadwallader will provide him with a swift demise. Bedecker quickly tires of immortality as he continuously tests his invulnerability. Jumping in front of trains, drinking poison, and more provide no thrill for the man. But an unfortunate accident provides Bedecker with an opportunity to potentially show off his immortality in a more spectacular way. This episode is fine. It's really not anything too special considering the much stronger concepts and stories that came immediately before and after it. You pretty much know where it's going as soon as Mr. Cadwallader shows up, who is played very well by Thomas Gomez. The manipulation and faint maniacal vibes that are entwined in his performance make for a strong version of the devil character. David Wayne as Walter Bedecker is written in a way that makes you root for his downfall. That type of characterization can sometimes be tricky to make interesting. There are plenty of cautionary tales and less than savory main characters in these Twilight Zone episodes, but more often than not, they're presented in a way that at least drives your curiosity. I was never curious to see what happened to Walter Bedecker. He's so unlikable that it made me want to jump forward just to finish the episode. The performance isn't the problem. David Wayne is just playing Bedecker as written, which is where I do think the problem lies. Maybe they were on a tight budget for this particular episode because we should have followed this character into the future and see him live in a few different eras before watching him get tired of his immortality. In the episode, it happens very, very fast. He seems to be collecting insurance money, which is a kind of humorous scheme Bedecker pulls off by constantly surviving life-threatening events. But that's a very short scene. Instead, we see him treat his wife like crap as he perpetually engages in activities that would kill anyone else. As Bedecker attempts to leap from the top of their apartment building, his wife Ethel tries to stop him and accidentally falls to her death. Bedeker's reaction is pretty cold.
I wonder what it felt like.
He calls the police and tells them he killed his wife so he can experience the electric chair. Bedeker does what he can to get the death penalty, but his lawyer is able to get him life in prison instead. Realizing that he'll be stuck in jail for eternity, he exercises his escape clause as Mr. Cadwallader pops up to kill him with a heart attack. Bedeker's eyes remain open after he's dead, which is a little creepy as the episode ends. While this kind of concept is done much better later in the series, I wouldn't call it an awful story. It just feels a little too bland and unoriginal for this show. At the time, it was praised quite heavily from Daily Variety, which said it was, quote, ranked with the best that has ever been accomplished in half-hour filmed television, end quote. Regardless, this is definitely an episode I would recommend you skip. Besides a good performance from Thomas Gomez and a few really nice shots from cinematographer George T. Clemens, its greatest claim to fame is an inspection plaque at Disney's Tower of Terror ride that is signed by Cadwallader. Safe to say there are many more interesting and thought-provoking adventures to be had inside the Twilight Zone. The Lonely was the first episode the production team shot after the series was ordered. The making of it is notable for shooting 2 full days in the middle of Death Valley. 130-degree heat made for a harrowing experience, as crew members were dropping like flies. They were filling in for each other whenever one of them went down, and a particularly scary scene saw cinematographer George T. Clemens faint and fall from a camera crane into the sand below. He ended up being okay, but that's just an example of how difficult the shooting conditions were. Even the oil-water combination they usually use to make it appear as if an actor was sweating wasn't working. It'd dry up before they can get a shot off. The solution to that problem ended up being the use of about 90% oil that finally somewhat did the trick. Twilight Zone episodes usually shoot for 3 days, and after 2 in the dangerous heat, the call was made to return to MGM Studios, reconstruct the lone interior set, and shoot the final day under controlled and more cooled conditions. Removing the production aspect of it, The Lonely is one of the most memorable installments of the series. Rod Serling wrote, Jack Smite directed, and Jack Warden starred in perhaps the first pure science fiction episode of The Twilight Zone to air. It's regularly recognized among the best of the show for its intriguing premise and brutal ending. Sometime in the future, an inmate named James Corey is isolated on an asteroid to serve 50 years solitary confinement. He was charged with murder, even though he only killed in self-defense. 4 times a year, a trio of astronauts, led by Captain Allenby, drop off supplies and bring Corey news from Earth. Allenby, and apparently most people involved in the case, believe Corey's story of self-defense. The inmate is struggling to make it day to day after over 4 years already served. On this latest very short trip, the captain leaves Corey something to help with his crippling loneliness. As the ship takes off, we see that Allenby left Corey an advanced robot in the form of a woman who supposedly feels pain, emotions, and most attributes that we'd consider to be human. At first, Corey sees this as a mockery and constant reminder of just how lonely he is. But slowly, he sees just how human the robot, named Alicia, truly is. When Allenby and his team return with urgent news, Corey is put in an even more complicated situation. Back when this episode came out in 1959, the prospect of the line between machine and human being blurred wasn't explored too much in mainstream entertainment. It had been done, but The Twilight Zone sort of brought that concept to a bit of a bigger audience, and that contemplative theme of what it means to be human is executed very well in The Lonely. Corey's initial reaction to Alicia is the beginning of an arc that can be interpreted in a few different ways.
Go on, get out of here!
My name's Alicia. What's your name?
He resents her presence at first, before growing close to her. Alicia also adapts to her possessor's preferences.
I hear my words coming from her, my emotions. The things that she has learned to love are those things that I've loved.
This can be seen as natural in a way, but at the end of the day, it is all programming, right? Is she just 100% mimicking Corey's emotions, or was she designed to have some sort of autonomy? It's not explicitly stated in the episode, but this is the Twilight Zone at its best, when we have these questions to contemplate, and how that might relate to our real lives in some form or fashion. Jack Warden gives a solid performance as a desperate, lonely man, while Jean Marsh plays the robotic, yet innocent role of Alicia very well. John Denner brings a sympathetic touch to his portrayal of Captain Allenby and is pretty much responsible for the whole ending predicament. Allenby and his team return to the asteroid 11 months after Alicia is activated. They rush to tell Corey all the sentences similar to his have been reviewed, and he's been granted a pardon. James Corey is to return to Earth immediately, but they must leave quickly. The ship is almost out of fuel, and if they miss their departure point, they might not ever make it home. With all the other inmates from the nearby asteroids on board, Corey can only bring 15 pounds of possessions. By this point, he's fallen in love with Alicia and sees her as a real woman. But she weighs more than 15 pounds. Corey rushes to her with Allenby and his team following. He hopes to prove to them she's real. With no time to spare, Allenby has no choice but to do the only thing he can think of to get Corey to come home before they're stranded.
No!
Now, the shocker back then was the big reveal of her caved-in mechanical face. Corey. Definitely a jarring finale. Allenby then gives Corey a few poignant words.
It's all behind you now, Corey. All you're leaving behind is loneliness.
With that, they all leave, and the episode ends on a bittersweet note. Loneliness was a theme Serling seemed to really enjoy exploring in these early episodes. It comes up quite a bit and is the main subject matter here. Director and star Jack Smite and Jack Warden would return for more Twilight Zone episodes, but The Lonely may just be their most well-known. This is a must-see episode of the show. Even the opening theme is a little altered just for this installment. So if you're going back to rewatch the series, don't skip this one. It's an emotionally effective story that's about much more than just a man and his robot.
She's a woman. Corey, she's a robot.
She's not a robot!
Sorry. Man and his robot. Time Enough at Last may very well be the most well-known Twilight Zone episode ever made. It stars the incomparable Burgess Meredith and was directed by John Bram. Bram directed the most Twilight Zone episodes of anyone, including 5 in the first season and 1 more with Meredith in the lead role. This episode has taken on much significance in pop culture, even to this day, for its ending, which we'll discuss in the twist section. It was based on a 1953 short story of the same name by Lynn Venable in If magazine. Rod Serling expanded on it for his purposes and made it one of the most memorable episodes of television in history. In fact, it was ranked at number 11 by TV Guide when they counted down the top 100 episodes of television in 2009. It's been homaged and parodied multiple times from Family Guy to Fear the Walking Dead, and it still holds up today. Henry Bemis is a bookish bank teller who spends every moment he can reading. He's often found reading books on the job to the point where his boss, Mr. Carsville, threatens to fire him if it happens again. Even Bemis's wife, Helen, hates his habit so much that she hides his books and crosses out all the pages of one he kept hidden from her. Bemis is a meek man and doesn't fight back much against their abuse. One day, he decides to take his lunch break in the bank vault so he can have some time reading without being scolded by his boss. In the middle of his leisure time, an atomic bomb goes off outside, killing everyone and everything. Bemis emerges from the vault unharmed and walks through the ruins of his town, only to discover how alone he truly is. If you know anything about me, you know I'm a huge Rocky fan. I grew up watching Burgess Meredith as Mickey Goldmill in those films and have a real fondness for him. And I know I'm not the only one. Many people often cite his portrayal as the Penguin in the 60s Batman show, but Meredith was a very popular actor even before all that. He was in movies like the 1939 version of Mice and Men and the 1945 film Story of G.I. Joe, just to name a few. His Twilight Zone appearances, starting with this one, deepen his legendary career, and Time Enough at Last became one of the pieces of media he's still most known for. His portrayal of Henry Bemis absolutely makes this episode work. He changed his voice, demeanor, and mannerisms to match that of a nervous but unassuming person. His glasses were so distorted he couldn't see out of them, so they only used those lenses for the close-up shots. He also sported a fake mustache to get the character to look that certain way. Burgess comes off extremely likable and sympathetic as he's constantly talked down to by those around him.
Why, Helen? Why do you do these things?
Because I'm married to a fool.
Later, when he's walking around in his destroyed neighborhood, you feel even more sorry for him.
Yes, I'm really extremely fortunate. Help. Help.
Serling seemed to be a big fan of his work, writing characters for Meredith in 3 more Twilight Zone episodes, and even offering him the lead role in a spin-off series. Burgess ended up turning that down, but there's no denying there was an obvious strong connection between Serling's writing and Meredith's acting, despite the two men not being close on a personal level. As phenomenal as he was in the role of Henry Bemis, Meredith is far from the only thing to love about Time Enough at Last. As mentioned earlier, John Brahm was a staple of this series, directing 12 episodes. This was the first one to air, and it may have been the peak of his work on the show. The visuals are both striking and beautiful. After the bomb goes off, Bemis returns to a world in ruins. It's a pretty dark moment, but I love this little sequence of Bemis seeing what's become of his boss.
As I've mentioned already. Miss Jackson, that's my speech for the Thursday night banquet. Could you type that up in triplicate?
This is all done very minimalistically, choosing to keep the scope of the destruction close to the character. The set design and backgrounds are done incredibly well. Cinematographer George T. Clemens captured this sense of destruction with a delicate hand. He used a blue filter to bring out more of the painted clouds and stormy skies. It was so unorthodox at the time that when he had someone fill in for him for a half day, they were scared to death of how to utilize it properly. But you can't argue with the results. The bank vault was also built on springs, so the camera and set could shake at the same time when the bomb exploded outside. Even the foreboding clue of the newspaper headline and wonderful visualization of the book flying open and pocket watch glass shattering were very effective small moments in the final product. Safe to say, this one has a look to it that didn't come along very often on the show. After wandering around for hours, finding food and a place to rest, Bemis contemplates suicide as he seems to be the only person left alive. But he eventually comes upon the ruins of the public library. Most of the books are intact, and he sees himself as saved. He now finally has the time to read as much as he always wanted. But as fate would have it, Bemis then utters the most famous lines in the show's history.
There was time now. There was all the time I needed.
What a great scene. Well acted, directed, and shot. The steps were located on the MGM backlot and decorated perfectly. It looks fantastic in the last crane shot, pulling away from Bemis. Rod Serling very rarely lets something bad happen to a good main character at the end of his Twilight Zone scripts, so this was a bit of a sad, pathetic shocker. I feel so sorry for Bemis that I kind of wish that he was written as a character more deserving of his fate, but that may not have made for such a memorable story. All in all, Time Enough at Last might just be the quintessential Twilight Zone episode. If you've never seen it, give it a watch. It's not my personal #1 favorite episode, but it's high up there, and positively stands the test of time. Perchance To Dream is the very first episode of The Twilight Zone to air not written by series creator Rod Serling. This time, it was written by soon-to-be frequent collaborator Charles Beaumont, and based on his short story of the same name from 1958. The title is of course derived from Hamlet's to be or not to be speech by William Shakespeare. It features solid performances from Richard Conte and Suzanne Lloyd, plus some well-shot and directed dream sequences, unique music, and his signature Twilight Zone twist ending. Edward Hall is a 35-year-old man with a severe heart condition. He visits a psychiatrist complaining of recurring episodic dreams that have him on edge. He hasn't slept for 87 hours and fears that once he falls back into his slumber, he'll be killed in his dream and not wake up. He goes on to explain to the psychiatrist that he's always had an overactive imagination and often scares himself into thinking terrifying things are happening when in reality there's no threat. It's been worse recently as his fear of sleep is delved into in detail. We're shown visual interpretations of Hall's dreams and the central tormentor in them, a carnival dancer named Maya. Since the airing of this episode in 1959, the theme of dreams and the blurring of reality have been explored in many different ways. Nightmare on Elm Street and Inception are a few bigger cinematic examples that have dealt with the concept in similar and different ways. Even Rod Serling's proto-Twilight Zone episode, The Time Element, had a few similar themes with vivid dreams and psychiatrists. So what I'm trying to say is that we've seen this kind of premise done a lot successfully, to the point where most modern audiences would be able to tell where a story like Perchance To Dream is going. To that point, it's not the very best episode that Charles Beaumont wrote for this show, but there is quite a bit to admire about it, particularly Richard Conte's turn as Edward Hall. His delivery and combination of an exhausted and frantic disposition kept me interested throughout.
If I go to sleep, I'll go right back to the roller coaster. Maya will reach me. She'll push me.
Suzanne Lloyd as the mysterious Maya brings a femme fatale flavor to this story. She's meant to represent Howard's possible demise, but as a seductive presence that tempts him into dangerous situations.
How do you know my name?
Oh, I know a lot of things. I'm Maya. Don't be afraid.
The music here by Van Cleve adds a very unique sense of abnormality that had not been utilized at this point in the series. It gets more intense as the episode goes along and almost becomes a character in itself by the end. But by far the best part of this episode are the visuals. From the beginning shot of the skyscraper, which might be stock footage, I'm not sure, to the surreal experience of Edward's amusement park dream. It's outstanding. Regular cinematographer George T. Clemens and veteran director Robert Florey brought a beautiful look to the different aspects of the carnival. Heavy shadows, canted angles, and distorted imagery gave it a striking appearance. The scene in the funhouse is the finest of the whole episode. The twisted sets give it a look similar to that of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The audio and pacing used in this scene are also quite creepy. Let's talk about the ending. After seeing that the psychiatrist's receptionist looks exactly like Maya, Edward goes mad and jumps out the window to his death. But in reality, he was still sleeping in the doctor's office, moments after entering. Apparently, he screamed and died of a heart attack right there on the couch. There are hints that most of the episode was a dream the whole way through. Lighting changes, close-ups, and even lines suggested what we were seeing wasn't quite on the up and up.
We've been expecting you, Mr. Hall. We've been expecting you, Mr. Hall.
Overall, it's a decent episode that Charles Beaumont wrote from some personal experience. Like this character, he also at times had an overactive imagination. Not unusual for a writer of this caliber, but he was frightened of roller coasters and supposedly dreamed in chapters. Beaumont also had complicated feelings about carnivals. Evidently, it was a sort of twisted attraction where he was a bit scared of them but enjoyed them just the same, much how like the Maya character is of a dual nature in relation to Edward. There are much better episodes written by Beaumont, but if you want to see his very first, check this one out. There's enough about it that should make for an entertaining trip into the Twilight Zone.
They say a dream takes only a second or so, and yet in that second a man can live a lifetime.
Judgment Night takes place on a ship out at sea in 1942. There's a mystery surrounding the identity of the main character that permeates the story. That identity is even a mystery to the main character himself. This was the first episode in the production order to be directed by John Brom, as he would go on to direct 11 more, including 4 additional episodes in Season 1. As stated in our Time Enough at Last video, that's the most of any director in the series. Of the first 18 episodes of The Twilight Zone, this was the only script censored by advertisers, although it's not as scandalous as you might think. Rod Serling explained in this 1959 interview with Mike Wallace.
We have had one line changed. On the bridge of a British ship, a sailor calls down to the galley and asks, in my script, for a pot of tea. One of my sponsors happens to sell instant coffee, and he took great umbrage with the idea of saying tea. And we decided we'd ask for a tray to be sent up to the bridge.
Tray to the bridge, please.
So no direct mentions of tea, but there are a few mentions of coffee.
How about some coffee, sir?
Thank you. I would like a cup of coffee.
Can I get you some more coffee?
Oh yes, much coffee. In the year 1942, a German-born man named Karl Lancer finds himself aboard a British cargo freighter, the SS Queen of Glasgow, crossing the Atlantic. He has no memory of how he got there and can only remember his name and birthplace. The passengers on board are friendly and make small talk about their current situation. Certain words and subjects slowly start to trigger Lancer as he gets closer to recovering his memory. He begins to panic when he realizes something awful will happen to the ship at 1:15 a.m. At that point, the ship's engines have been shut down and they drift in the ocean when another vessel is seen approaching. Lancer is played here by Nehemiah Persoff. The amnesia his character experiences throughout the episode is exaggerated quite a bit. For the time, I'm sure it was a fine performance, but looking back with a modern lens shows that there wasn't much subtlety in his delivery.
Doom. We're being stalked. I know we're being stalked. We will drift until 1:15.
I wouldn't call it a bad performance, but we did see the amnesiac-type character played much better throughout the series. The deliberate, slow pacing and ghostly cinematography of the episode gives it an ominous tone. That's probably the best part about it. You can really feel the tension slowly rise as we're placed in a calm-before-the-storm scenario. When 1:15 hits, Lancer starts shouting to abandon ship, but can't find anyone. That is, until he goes below deck.
What do I have to do to you? Do I have to grab you and put you on deck? Do I have to grab you bodily and put you in the lifeboats?
That shot in the hallway with Lancer screaming and cutting to the creepy dead stares of some of the passengers are very effective. He then heads above and shouts the names of those he's met on board. The empty echo drives home the gloomy reality of what's about to happen. This is Persoff's best acting in the episode, and leads up to the big reveal of Lancer seeing himself leading the approaching enemy ship. The freighter is relentlessly attacked as everyone on board is killed. The ship then sinks after Lancer disappears under the murky water. On the attacking German U-boat, we see Captain Lancer gloating over sinking the Queen of Glasgow. When his second-in-command informs him that women and children were on the ship, Lancer shows no remorse. His subordinate goes on to express his guilt and wonders what kind of divine punishment men like them will receive for such a heinous act. We then see Lancer again appear on the Queen of Glasgow, uncertain of how he got there. He's doomed to repeat the same event over and over, dying with those he mercilessly killed without warning. The ending, and really last 8 minutes or so, make this episode a worthwhile watch. It's not a must-see installment, but its spooky mood, pacing, and setting make Judgment Night a quality dark trip into the waters of the Twilight Zone. And When the Sky Was Opened is loosely based on Richard Matheson's short story, Disappearing Act, from 1953. The teleplay was written by Rod Serling and had very little to do with Matheson's piece, minus the idea of people disappearing from existence. Matheson was a prominent writer on the show, so it's unclear why he didn't adapt his own work. Serling did later mention that he wanted to make the story slightly more rational, which is why he used astronauts for the main characters instead of the writer character from the original story. Astronauts Clegg Forbes, Ed Harrington, and William Gart just returned from a mission 900 miles into space. About 4 hours into their voyage, they all blacked out and awoke 1 day later in the desert. Their ship crashed and Gart's leg injured. After being released from the hospital, Forbes and Harrington go out to celebrate when the latter gets a strange feeling. He calls his parents, who have no recollection of him, and soon after, he's gone, nowhere to be found. When Forbes asks around, he discovers that no one has ever heard of Ed Harrington, and even the newspaper hailing the 3 astronauts' safe return to Earth has changed, instead featuring a picture of just Forbes and Gart with no mention of Harrington anywhere. Clegg slowly starts panicking as he talks to person after person who tell him they never knew an Ed Harrington. Even back at the hospital, William Gart acts as if his co-pilot never existed. Forbes struggles to try and convince his remaining partner on the mission that there was a third astronaut before his fear of something similar happening to them comes to fruition. Director Douglas Hayes entered the Twilight Zone with this episode, but it was far from his last. He directed 3 others in the first season and 9 total. Rod Serling and producer Buck Houghton often encouraged directors to take initiative with the scripts and do something unexpected with their visualization. Hayes took that to heart, and there are a handful of examples in this episode that were strong directorial choices, which interpreted Serling's writing in a less predictable way. A few of the most obvious are Forbes bursting through the glass door of the bar and how the feeling of disappearing was portrayed. Originally, Serling had it written as a painful experience, but Hayes decided it would be more interesting if they played it up as a sort of euphoric event. The production team was impressed enough with his vision that they brought Hayes back many more times. The cast is very likable in this one. Led by Rod Taylor as U.S. Air Force Colonel Clegg Forbes, the panic of the situation plays out in our lead's frenetic performance. He's very believable as a man who's not sure what's going on or why it's happening. What I like most about his depiction is that he never doubts himself. Forbes is sure what he knows is fact, but that just makes everything all the more terrifying. You can almost put yourself in his shoes. How would you react if your best friend of 15 years vanished and the world around you functioned as if he or she never existed?
Ed Harrington! Ed Harrington! Why doesn't anybody remember me?
Eventually, he snaps when revisiting the bar Ed disappeared in. That's where the glass breaking comes in, as a very effective culmination of his anger and frustration. Rod Taylor was an Australian. His American accent is very convincing here. He was in many film projects over the years, including The Birds, Inglourious Basterds, and he even voiced Pongo in the original 101 Dalmatians animated movie. There are also some angles in this episode where he bears a strong resemblance to Robin Williams. Unimportant, but it was something I noticed. Charles Aidman as Harrington and Jim Hutton as Gart also bring a lot to their roles. Hutton plays concern, sympathy, and compassion for his friend Clegg when he's being told the wild story about a third astronaut he doesn't remember.
Clegg, I don't know Ed Harrington.
In the end, Forbes is correct about this phenomenon passing on to him, as he starts to sense that same indescribable feeling Harrington did.
This is weird. It's just plain weird. Like I just don't belong.
That last camera movement panning around and under Forbes' face is a great one. Director Hayes said he did it to make it look as if the Colonel was ascending. Clegg then looks into the mirror to see no reflection. Well, almost. They sort of botched the angle of the mirror where you can still see his arm. They played that mirror up a few times earlier in the episode, too. He then gets completely hysterical and runs out of the room. When Gart looks into the hallway, Forbes is gone.
Colonel Forbes, somebody's got to help him right away. Who? Colonel Forbes!
Soon enough, Gart is gone too, in addition to the aircraft they traveled in. It's not explained what happened to them, as it's left up to the imagination. Rod Serling would later say that the bizarre question was enough without an exact answer. I agree that sometimes it is better to leave an ending open, but Twilight Zone is known for its outlandish twist finishes, and this lacking one is definitely out of the ordinary. There are a few lines that suggest some extraterrestrial force was responsible, that maybe somebody or something made a mistake and let them come back to Earth when they shouldn't have.
Gotta come back to get us. Somebody up there.
There's a shot earlier in the episode where Forbes backs out onto a balcony. The stars in the sky behind him are twinkling like the stars do in the Twilight Zone intro and outro. Is this the Twilight Zone itself distorting and changing existence? We know that moment was a purely visual directorial decision by Douglas Hayes, so my theory is likely not the answer, but I did find that interesting. Honestly, this story reminds me of an episode in Season 4 called The Parallel, where an astronaut returns to what seems to be home. However, in actuality, it's some sort of parallel universe with small differences from the world the astronaut remembers. So when answering how I'd fill in the blank on the ending of And When the Sky Was Open, I think an interesting explanation would be something similar. Or maybe the universe is just changing around them as it resets to how things were supposed to be. You could also say there are interdimensional alien beings pulling all those strings and warping reality as they abduct the astronauts. I want to hear what your explanation would be to the ending of this episode, so leave a comment below or drop me a line on Twitter. This is an episode worth revisiting, so I look forward to your answers. But one thing about this ending is for sure. It took place in the land of both shadow and substance. that we often call the Twilight Zone. What You Need was based on the 1945 short story of the same name by Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore under their joint pseudonym Lewis Paget. This episode also wasn't the first on-screen adaptation of it. Before The Twilight Zone, there was another science fiction anthology TV show called Tales of Tomorrow. They aired their episodes live on ABC from 1951 to 1953 and had many big-name talents featured during its run. Paul Newman, James Dean, Boris Karloff, Cloris Leachman, Leslie Nielsen, and more all made appearances. Their episode was much closer to the original story than the one adapted by Rod Serling, and is available to watch on the Twilight Zone Blu-ray set. Actually, most of the Tales of Tomorrow episodes are public domain, so you should be able to track them down online if you want to see any. Watching both versions of What You Need back-to-back made for an educational experience. An old street peddler named Padat has a knack for knowing exactly what people need when they need it. He shows this ability off in a bar with a down-on-his-luck former Major League pitcher.
He pitched for a couple of years for the Cubs. What does he do now? He comes in here 7 nights a week.
Used to pitch for the Cubs and now gets drunk 7 nights a week? Yeah, that checks out. Anyway, Padat feels sorry for him and hands over a bus ticket.
Bus ticket to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Now what's in Scranton, Pennsylvania, old man?
Unfortunately, no, there's no Dunder Mifflin appearance. Would have been a heck of a Twilight Zone twist, though. A moment after he gets the ticket, the payphone at the bar rings. The man then hears he's been offered a coaching position for a minor league team in Scranton. He's supposed to meet with the general manager soon, but there's a stain on his suit coat. Earlier, Padat gave a bottle of stain remover to a woman at that same bar. She takes the opportunity to offer it to the former pitcher, and they are immediately attached to each other. Padat leaves before they can question him, but a man named Fred Renard has been watching and confronts him outside. Fred is a shady character who forces Padat to give him what he needs. Padat hands over a pair of scissors that come in handy later when Renard's scarf gets caught in an elevator door, nearly strangling him. After that, Fred confronts Padat again with the aim of exploiting the old man's gift for his own personal gain. Padat is a gentleman and doesn't want to participate in Renard's scheme, but every time he approaches him, Fred gets more and more threatening. In the original story, the old man with the ability to look into the future was a scientist who used a machine. Serling liked the basic idea but swapped out the scientific explanation with the more vague fantasy element of Padat having an unexplainable power. As such, it fits right in as a Twilight Zone episode, and one I enjoyed quite a bit. The pacing of this episode is a little slower, but it works because the tone here is so intriguing. The mood is set by some great-looking shots of the dark urban neighborhood the story is set in. This was shot on the backlot at MGM, but they did a really nice job of making it look even more realistic than usual. I think the bright flashing lights and damp reflective streets add a lot of character to the atmosphere. The overall look of the episode is just really engaging. Credit to director Alvin Ganzer and usual DP George T. Clemens. In addition to a solid score by Van Cleve, this episode has a really strong cast all around. While Ernest Truex can be a little overly mysterious at times as Padat, he shines in a few great exchanges.
Serenity, peace of mind, humor, the things you need most, I can't supply.
Steve Cochran as Renard plays a convincing angry brute. There's an underlying sadness to the character that's hidden under his indignant demeanor.
I was born under a lousy zodiac or something. I've been getting the dirty end of the stick ever since I was 4 years old.
The rest of the cast does well in their shorter parts too. The bartender, former pitcher, and spot remover woman pepper the beginning of this episode with charismatic turns. After dropping a hint on a winning racehorse, Fred continues to pester Padat about giving him more things he'll need for the future. Forcing the issue, Renard looks to Padat's travel case and takes out a pair of shoes. He thinks this is what he needs and puts them on, but they're too tight and have slippery leather soles. Padat crosses the street to get away from him when a car turns the corner. Fred slips on the wet road and can't move. He's then hit by the car and killed. Padat goes on to explain that he regretfully set the event up for this to happen.
You were going to kill me. So what was needed was slippery shoes.
The moment where Renard is hit by the car is pretty bad. It's sped up like a Three Stooges short and kind of undercuts the moment in an otherwise visually impressive episode. In the original story, he falls in front of a train, and in the Tales of Tomorrow episode, the car accident happens off-screen. That's much more effective and a better visual choice than what we got here. But it's not a huge complaint, as the episode was done really well overall. I think it's worth checking out, both versions actually, but I do think the slightly better one took place in the Twilight Zone. The Four of Us Are Dying is noteworthy for several different reasons. It has a film noir tone, gorgeous cinematography and set design, a wonderful score by Jerry Goldsmith, features 4 actors playing the same role, has a small cameo by the future co-creator of Hogan's Heroes, and in this rare occurrence, the ending narration doesn't mention the Twilight Zone. Based on the unpublished short story All of Us Are Dying by George Johnson, this episode had a challenging pre-production. Originally, they tested makeup to see if one actor can pull off the different faces the main character takes on. Unfortunately, it wasn't feasible, as the actor would have to spend more time in the makeup chair than on the actual set. The process of casting 4 men to play the same role was a difficult one. Several changes were made leading up to the shoot that recast the actors more than once. Serling's adaptation of Johnson's story changed almost everything except the main concept, that concept being a man who can mold his face to take on appearances of other people. Arch Hammer is a con man who has the ability to change his facial features into that of others. In one night, he plans to take on the appearance of 2 recently deceased men. The first is a musician named John Foster. He goes to a club where Foster's girlfriend Maggie sings to reintroduce Johnny to her. Hammer is so taken by her beauty, talent, and love for the man whose face he's wearing, he hopes to continue the relationship, this time with him playing the part of Foster. Next, he changes his face to that of murdered criminal Virgil Sturrig and heads for the residence of the man who had him killed, Mr. Pennell. Once there, he helps himself to cash that Sturrig was owed and more. After the initial shock wears off, Pennell sends his thugs after Hammer, who's cornered in an alleyway. With no other choice, he changes his face again to that of a boxer he sees on a nearby poster. He escapes that situation, but soon runs into the boxer's father and quickly learns of their bad blood. The lives of those Hammer takes on the face of start to catch up with him in a very well-executed episode directed by John Brahm. Let's talk about the acting first. Harry Towns, Ross Martin, Don Gordon, and Philip Pine are all great playing the same role with different layers. I'd say Ross Martin's scene with Beverly Garland, who plays Maggie, may be the best. Garland's reaction to seeing her resurrected significant other is truly outstanding. She's definitely the scene stealer in this episode. Her chemistry with Martin passionately pops off the screen.
You put me back together again, Johnny, and I love you. I love you, Martin.
Everyone else is pretty solid, especially Don Gordon's scene with the father character. He's juggling so many different motivations there. It's really impressive.
I don't remember you, old man. How do I know you?
As a son should know his father.
Philip Pine's scene with the gangster, Mr. Pennell, is done well. Although, he does say that name about 500 times in 2 minutes.
Mr. Pennell, 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 Mr. Pennell.
That is Bernard Fine playing Pennell, by the way. He would go on to co-create Hogan's Heroes a few years later. As good as the acting can be, the real star of this episode is the stunning cinematography and set design. George T. Clemens does it again. Right away, we're hit with bright neon lights on a city street set. They're unnaturally overlapping, but that just adds to the surreal visuals that give this episode life. The canted angles give us a unique perspective too, and the stark black and white add to the overall style. I just love how this looks. Even if they clumsily freeze frame on the hotel sign Hammer is staying at. They do it a couple times too. I thought my Blu-ray froze. Anyway, the visual cues that set up Hammer's face-changing abilities are pretty clever. Using one shot, they show him shaving in the mirror with different actors swapping in and out. The subtle choreography and camera timing that took couldn't have been easy. Everything is enhanced by the film noir tone and strong musical composition from the legendary Jerry Goldsmith. They used stock music he made for CBS and other episodes, but this is the first that credited him directly. Hammer's escapades start to catch up with him as he's about to be taken into the police station by a detective who enters his room. To shake him, Hammer goes through the revolving door and comes out the other end as Andy Marshak, the boxer character from earlier. The detective leaves to look for Hammer when Marshak's father approaches the man wearing his son's face.
And now, you pay off, son.
Now, wait a minute. You got the wrong guy. I'll show you honest. But I gotta think. I gotta concentrate!
Yep, he shoots him dead right there. Hammer's face transitions to all the faces he recently wore before returning to his own as the episode ends. I like the theme of the complexities of other people's lives ultimately doing Hammer in. It's a poetic finish to a very strong and unique installment of the show. I wouldn't say it's perfect. I mean, the guy who plays Marshak's dad is a little stiff, and not everything makes sense within the context of the story, like how Hammer can somehow change his voice and other features to match the person he's imitating. But it's easy to look past when the other qualities are executed so well. It's beautiful to look at and well worth re-examining or seeing for the first time. It's just waiting to be feasted on by your eyes. A feast that's a rare delicacy in the Twilight Zone.
Mr. Bennell.
Third from the Sun is based on Richard Matheson's 1940 short story of the same name. Rod Serling wrote the teleplay, and Richard L. Baer directed his first of 7 episodes. Harry Wilde filled in for regular cinematographer George T. Clemens, and it shows. Baer and Wilde conceived of a very distinctive and odd look for this episode, and it all makes sense considering where the story was headed. A scientist named Will Sturka works for a military base that's developing atomic bombs at an accelerated rate. War is close to happening, and with it, the destruction of the entire world. The government is identifying anyone who speaks out against their plans, and people are warned to even be careful of what they think. Sturka has been conceiving a plan with his friend, pilot Jerry Ryden, to take their families and escape into space on an experimental ship before it's too late. But prying eyes and ears may be more aware of their plan than the pair realizes. Rod Serling seemed to usually get the rights to a story and change it completely for the Twilight Zone, but with this one, he stuck pretty close to the original, and I'm glad he did. Third from the Sun is filled with tension from beginning to end. Sturka and Ryden's covert conversations about how they're going to escape add a paranoia to the episode that ends up being justified. Every scene, from the acting and dialogue to the music and visuals, suggests anxiety. The acting from Fritz Weaver as Sturka and Edward Andrews as Carling is especially good.
You better mind what you say. And what I think, too. Yeah, and what you think.
Weaver would later be in probably my favorite episode called The Obsolete Man, but here he leads the story very well. The Carling character keeps popping up throughout the runtime as the pressure on our main characters increases.
Clear as a bell, nothing but stars. You ever think, Sturka, that there may be people on those stars, too?
With the music helping the atmosphere, Andrews is super creepy as Carling. And I mean super creepy. Something about that performance, whether it be his tone of voice or how he doesn't move his mouth much when he talks, just makes my skin crawl. Even how he moves. Look at how he drinks that lemonade and grabs the paper from the table. He has all the slimy charisma of an evil slug. I mean that as a compliment to Edward Andrews, of course. He pops up in another episode in Season 5 called You Drive, where he plays another unsavory character. The unique look of this episode really makes it stand out. All the shots in the Sturka home are canted or at other interesting angles. One of my favorites is at the table when they're playing poker.
16.
4.
no more for the cheerleader, okay?
Most of these scenes are either lit from underneath or in a way to create interesting and somewhat unnerving shadows. The set decoration and art direction by Rudy Butler, Henry Grace, George W. Davis, and William Ferrari also provide clues in the background about what the story might be hinting at revealing. Everything looks kind of off, although I do love that phone.
Yes?
I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention those shots of the car. It looks like it's on some kind of treadmill, and even the sound it makes is strange. The two families make it to the area where the spacecraft is, which is in the shape of a flying saucer, but are stopped at gunpoint by Carling. They're able to fight him off and ascend away in the aircraft before the powers that be can stop them. Quick note, the flying saucer and I believe the interior plus the stock shot of it flying are from the 1956 movie Forbidden Planet. Twilight Zone reused a lot of set pieces and props like that from other MGM productions since they shot at their studios and on those same backlots. Once safely on their voyage, Sturka and Ryden mention they're looking to travel to a planet 11 million miles away.
It's the third planet from the sun, Bill. It's called Earth.
It's a great reveal that's slowly built up throughout the episode. Everything from how the car sounded, to the phone, the music Sturka listens to early on, and the background clues like the strange set dressing and camera shots tell you that this isn't quite the place we live. I really like that painting in the background that also foreshadows how they're trying to escape a doomed world. The aesthetics combined with a tension-filled story and absorbing characters make Third from the Sun a great episode to watch or rewatch. Picking up all the subtle hints that this isn't Earth make it a lot of fun the second or third time around. It goes to show you that sometimes things aren't obvious. Sometimes it's the small details that make a big difference. In the Twilight Zone. I Shot an Arrow into the Air has an interesting story behind the creation of it. Apparently, Rod Serling was at a party when he was approached by a woman named Madeline Champion. She explained the very basic idea and ending twist to Serling, who was so taken with the concept that he paid her $500 on the spot and gave her a credit in the episode. That kind of thing never happened again. This title was used for one of the original pilot scripts Serling made for the series. He instead used the title here, and that original pilot story was eventually made into the episode The Gift from Season 3. The production crew returned to Death Valley to shoot this episode. It was still incredibly hot, but after the production of The Lonely, they learned their lesson. Their food was light, and they took a 2-hour lunch break back at their hotel instead of the 45-minute on-set lunch that was the norm. From what it sounds like, nobody passed out from heat exhaustion this time. The story follows the first manned spaceflight from Earth. After the rocket known as Arrow 1 takes off, interference blocks out communications, and the control base is unable to find the aircraft. We see that they've crashed on an asteroid, and all but 4 of the astronauts died in the wreck, with 1 mortally wounded and on his last legs. The unharmed survivors are Colonel Bob Donlin and his crewmen Corey and Pearson. Corey immediately starts resenting his fellow astronauts when they give water to their dying colleague. With limited resources, the trio must survive for as long as possible without turning on each other.
I shot an arrow into the air. It landed I know not where.
The episode opens on a lot of stock footage, which blends in decently well. After one short scene in the control room, it's to the desert for the remainder of the runtime. The director of Cool Hand Luke, Stuart Rosenberg, helmed this project. It attempts to show us what can happen when staying alive takes precedence over friendship and compassion for your fellow man. Does it execute that successfully? Not really. I think this either needed to be longer or the pacing of it adjusted to drive that point home. Things just move too fast. There's not enough time spent with the characters to quite feel their struggle, and there's not much of a question where these characters are going. The ending twist is a good one, and we'll get to that in a minute, but the main problem here is the Corey character.
Colonel Donlin, it's hot, see? It's very hot.
Right away, he is extremely irritating. Most of it is the writing, but honestly, Dewey Martin's interpretation of the material didn't help much. He worked a ton, and I'm sure he was a decent actor, but here, he's all sorts of annoying.
I'm 1 man out of 3 who's going to need water. And 5 gallons isn't going to last very long.
I get what they're doing, but we needed to see some kind of build-up to Corey's current attitude. Donlin and Pearson mention how odd he's acting.
You were with Corey during the crash. What happened to him?
Nothing that I know of, sir. I can't understand it either.
But I feel like that's a cheap shortcut for his character development. And out of all 3 main players, he's the one that needed to be the most established as the story moves along. He's just too much of an obvious villain in this situation.
Colonel! This man's gonna die!
If he dies, he dies.
As a shock to no one, Corey kills Pearson, then Donlin, and takes their supplies to survive longer. Before he died, Pearson drew a shape in the sand that Donlin wasn't able to decipher, and Corey dismisses. With his comrades dead, Corey walks for miles and miles, until he sees...
Oh!
That's right, they were on Earth the whole time. The symbol Pearson was making was supposed to represent telephone poles. It's a good twist, unlike Martin's acting here.
We never left the Earth. We just crashed back into it.
Of course, there are some scientific, logical leaps here, but it's the Twilight Zone. It's fantasy before pure science fiction most of the time. I can look past those little issues pretty easily, but when the character motivations seem weak, uninspired, and come off too forced in the writing and acting, that's not as easy to forgive in a show as high quality as this one. In any case, I Shot an Arrow into the Air is remembered quite fondly by most fans, so I'm in the minority and not really liking this episode too much. But if you saw it, what did you think? Definitely let me know. In the meantime, I'll be hitchhiking my way back into the Twilight Zone. The Hitchhiker is a creepy episode. It's just an eerie experience from beginning to end. I dare say most Twilight Zone episodes don't reach the uncanny, unsettling heights this story succeeds at giving us. It's adapted from Lucille Fletcher's radio play, which first premiered in 1941 and featured the voice of Orson Welles in the lead role. Fletcher's first husband was actually Bernard Herrmann, the composer of the first Twilight Zone theme and many of its episodes. He scored the original radio play, and some of that music was used here in the TV version. Serling heard the radio play when he was a teenager and never forgot it. In his adaptation, he changed the main character to a woman named Nan, which was the nickname of one of his daughters. Fletcher wasn't thrilled about the gender swap, but most of the main plot points were kept intact. Nan Adams is a 27-year-old woman on a road trip from New York to California. After a tire blowout in Pennsylvania, she gets her car repaired and starts seeing a mysterious hitchhiker appear over and over. No matter how fast she drives, no matter where she goes, he pops up from time to time with the same blank expression and thumb outstretched in the air. Desperate to find a way to lose him, she takes the back roads off the beaten path, but eventually runs out of gas. After being refused fuel late at night, a sailor helps her along. Looking for anyone to drive with to protect her from the hitchhiker, Nan convinces the sailor to let her drop him off at his destination in San Diego. However, soon after, she tries to run over the hitchhiker upon seeing him again, and the sailor becomes disturbed by Nan's strange demeanor. To her dismay, he exits the vehicle and leaves her alone. Looking to hear a familiar voice, the young woman then makes a call that ends up being much more than she bargained for. This episode is of the regular 25-minute length the series ran for most of its installments, but because of the pacing, it feels much longer, and I mean that in a good way. It doesn't drag at all, it really feels like a movie. A Hitchcock movie, to be specific. The looming sense of dread and overall ominous tone directly correlates with some of Hitchcock's famous work. Even some of the characters and a few shots remind me of the legendary director's style. Maybe that's why he tried to buy the rights to the story before Serling was able to snatch it up. In any case, director Alan Ganser did a great job bringing this story to visual life. Most of it was shot on location across highways and such, and that really helps it feel more authentic. almost too authentic at one point for the production crew. There's a part in the episode where Nan gets stuck on a set of train tracks as an oncoming locomotive barrels toward her. The original shot Ganser wanted was directly on the tracks, with the train coming straight on. But when another train passed by the production crew heading the other direction, they realized that probably wasn't the safest idea and stepped off to the side of the tracks to get the shot. The hitchhiker himself and how they shoot him is chilling. He barely does anything, and that's what makes him so creepy. It's just this weird, relentless stare. Sometimes he kind of smiles and he does have a few lines, but Leonard Strong as this character effectively gave me the heebie-jeebies. Ugh, that freaks me out. Those unexpected close-ups work perfectly.
Heading west?
No! No, I'm not heading west, I'm sorry.
Inger Stevens does an excellent job playing Nan Adams here. Her frightened attitude keeps the character constantly and exponentially on edge throughout the episode. With the threat of the reappearing hitchhiker driving her mad, her discussions with the other characters are filled with anxiety.
I've been seeing this man all the time, but he just stands there and he doesn't do anything. I think he's trying to rob me.
Well, if he does, then you come back here and I'll call the sheriff.
No, please!
Her pleas with the sailor to stay with her range from begging to even enticing him with a date. Anything to not be alone on the road.
You can't go, you understand that? You just can't go.
No thanks.
Look, I like you. I thought that we could be friends, and I'd kind of like for you to take me out.
I'm sorry, ma'am.
The inclusion of several narrations by the character also helped to flesh her out. Additionally, this was a way to keep a lot of the radio play's original dialogue in the story.
The terror isn't formless. It has a form. He was beckoning me.
It helps to hear these words as thoughts, since saying all this out loud wouldn't do the character any favors, as evidenced in a story like Where Is Everybody, where that character doesn't have much motivation to speak, but does so anyway. Stevens' nonverbal acting is also top-notch. It's underplayed at times, then bursts out in these horrified expressions. Her sometimes dull demeanor seems like a conscious choice on the part of the director and actor, and it all makes sense in the twist. After the sailor leaves her to fend for herself, Nan makes a call to her mother so she can calm down, but she's apparently not home because of a nervous breakdown.
What do you mean a nervous breakdown?
Well, it's all taken place since the death of her daughter. Nan was killed just 6 days ago in an automobile accident in Pennsylvania.
Her remaining emotion drains from her body as Nan vacantly returns to her car.
I believe you're going my way.
The hitchhiker is meant to be a form of death or the Grim Reaper, and it's one of the better twists in the first season. This all being a ghost story from the perspective of the ghost was brilliant. I think people often associate the Twilight Zone with being creepy or scary, but there are a whole ton of episodes that don't aim for that at all. However, The Hitchhiker is one of those memorable stories that probably defined the series for a lot of folks. It's easy to see why. This is one to go out of your way to see. But it's just one stop on the winding road that is the Twilight Zone. The Fever is one of those more obvious cautionary tales that the series did very well. It's a simple story written by Serling and directed by Robert Florey that tackles the topic of gambling and addiction in general. Its exaggerated story highlights how easily one can fall into a vice that can take over your entire life. Franklin and Flora Gibbs won a free trip to Las Vegas and are staying at a luxurious hotel and casino. Flora is happy to be on vacation and excited to gamble a little bit. Her uptight husband Franklin, not so much. His stingy attitude is in direct contrast with the environment he's in. He scolds her for wanting to gamble and considers it throwing away money, but when a drunk patron of the casino gives him his last coin and guides his hand to put it into a slot machine, Franklin reluctantly pulls the lever and wins a small jackpot. Later, he hears his name being called by what sounds like tinkling coins and gives in to the temptation of going back to the same machine. Soon enough, he's lost loads of money and hasn't slept for 24 hours. Nothing and nobody can pull him away from trying to hit another jackpot. His once self-important stance of not gambling has given way to an uncontrollable addiction. An addiction that's about to take more than just Mr. Gibbs' cash. On the surface, this episode seemed like it would have had a standard production behind it. It doesn't really feature anything too outlandish for the series, and it mostly takes place in one indoor location. But back when this episode was shot, gambling machines of any kind were illegal in California, so getting the one-armed bandit that's our main villain here was not easy for the production team. They had to retrieve one from the local police department where they were impounded. An officer even had to accompany them on the shoot to make sure no one ended up taking it home. The other considerable challenge was the quote-unquote voice of the slot machine. Really great sound design there. Apparently they achieved this by strapping speakers to a male subject's esophagus. They recorded coins tinkling together to match the sound of a slot machine's payout, and those sounds came out of the speakers as the subject mouthed, so the noise originated from his throat, which created the unique sound effect. I gotta say, that is very creative and the most distinctive part of the episode. Everett Sloane as Franklin Gibbs, previously in Rod Serling's breakout project, Patterns, delivered an effective performance. The character's not exactly likable before he becomes addicted to the machine. His scenes with his wife show us he's at the very least a really grumpy older guy.
Oh, Franklin, try to enjoy it, won't you?
He also has this self-righteous streak that he uses to justify going back to play the slot machine again.
If there's one thing I know, Flora, it's morality, and I will not have this tainted money smelling up our pockets.
Once Franklin becomes completely addicted, he's an even nastier person.
Flora, will you kindly shut your mouth? Now please go away and leave me alone!
Please, people are listening.
The devil with people!
As much of a jerk as he is, you also start to feel sorry for him. He's completely helpless and a slave to the machine.
It's inhuman, the way it lets you win a little and then takes it all back.
Ultimately, Franklin's last dollar gets stuck in the slot machine. He goes ballistic and knocks it over, demanding his money back. Franklin is carried off back to his room, where he continues to hear his name called.
Franklin.
He starts seeing it inside his room to the point where he's driven mad. It then slowly stalks him as Franklin steps further back, terrified. Franklin falls to his death, where the slot machine mocks him, rolling his silver dollar back to his lifeless corpse. There's a question as to if the slot machine truly had a mind of its own as Rod Serling's closing narration plays, and the episode ends. The fever hits the target of what it was aiming to portray, and is an enjoyable Twilight Zone watch. The close-ups they use to show off how people react to the highs and lows of gambling put on display the rush the characters are feeling. The first time Franklin pulls the lever is very ominous, and honestly, kind of sexual. In any case, it illustrates the compulsion that goes along with any addiction, and with its dark ending, the fever leaves you wanting to keep your vices in check and out of the Twilight Zone. The Last Flight is a really well-made episode that puts the focus on story, premise, and characters over any outstanding cinematography or other on-set production work. That's all fine, of course, but what draws you into this particular installment is the time-bending situation our main character is put in and the purpose of his predicament. The acting from Kenneth Haig also brings that main character to life with an engrossing performance. This is the first script not written by Rod Serling to go into production. Richard Matheson's short story Disappearing Act had previously been adapted into the episode And When the Sky Was Opened, but this was the first of many episodes he explicitly wrote himself. Usually, writers had to submit a full outline to get a story approved by Rod Serling and producer Buck Houghton, but in this case, the idea was so vivid that Matheson had no problem just telling the premise to them directly. It was approved by both producers and shot almost exactly as written. The only significant change was the title. Matheson's original script was simply called Flight, before being changed to The Last Flight by the time the episode aired. It's a strong start to a great run of stories that Matheson had on the show. In 1917, British Royal Flying Corps 2nd Lieutenant William Terence Decker flies into a thick cloud and exits it, landing at an airport. The year is now 1959. The airport is Lafayette Air Base in Reims, France, an American military station. The officers there are thoroughly confused by the presence of a World War I era plane at the then modern airbase. Things get even more strange when Decker tells them his story, complete with identification of who he is and when he's from. He left his flying partner, Alexander Mackay, as he was surrounded by 7 German planes right before flying up into the cloud that brought Decker to the future. Thinking himself a coward and his friend dead, he's surprised to hear that Mackay is to arrive at the airbase that same day. Reckoning with what he thinks of as not only a moment but a life of cowardice, Decker starts to put together an idea of why he was brought to 1959 and how he can atone for his inaction. The vintage plane used in this episode was brought in and flown by its owner, Frank Gifford Tallman, and had been on screen in many World War I movies. When it first landed at the Air Force Base, which was of course in California, doubling as the one in France, jet pilots were captivated by the old aircraft, so much so that it had to be roped off and guarded for the duration of the shoot. The juxtaposition of such an old-world piece of aviation with the then modern airfield and equipment made for some striking visuals. Cinematographer George T. Clemens picked up on this and made sure to roll on some appropriately comparative shots during the production. It definitely helped exemplify the man-out-of-time story that was already being told so well by the script. The centerpiece of this episode is the performance of Kenneth Haig as Decker. He's got an almost Ewan McGregor kind of charisma with his British accent and appearance. His arc becomes clearer as the episode goes along. We slowly start to see the immense guilt he's been carrying with him, which makes for some effective character-driven scenes.
All my life I've been running away, pretending to be something I never was, never could be. My kind of strained idiocy is exactly the brand we all put on. Playing the part, you know?
Simon Scott plays Major Wilson, who cautiously starts to believe Decker's story. The sympathy Wilson shows for the pilot comes through in a few exchanges. His determination to get to the bottom of how Decker came to be in 1959 is played well. The thing both men can't understand is just how Decker's flying partner, Mackay, survived the deadly situation he left him in.
But I thought you said you were fighting 3 German planes yourself, so how...
I wasn't fighting anyone, I was running! When the Germans came at us, I left him up there to die!
Well, he didn't die!
Well, I can't understand that!
When Wilson mentions that someone had to be there to help Mackay survive, Decker has a eureka moment.
Maybe it wasn't an accident that I landed here. Maybe I was brought here for a purpose, to find out that time was giving me a second chance. You've got to let me go.
Wilson refuses, but Decker knocks him and another officer out to escape where they're holding him. He makes it to the plane, where Wilson holds him at gunpoint.
Turn it off, Decker, I'll fire!
Oh, fire! I'd rather die.
Wilson lets him go, Decker disappearing into the clouds. When Air Vice Marshal Mackay arrives on the base, he's asked about the details Decker told Wilson. After they match up, Mackay says Decker saved his life by rescuing him from 7 German planes in World War I. He shot 3 of them down before they took him out. It's mentioned that Decker's personal affects were never returned, after which Mackay is shown the identification that was left behind and is about to hear the wild story of how his friend who saved his life all those years ago was just standing in the same place he stands now. This was a really well-executed, complete story. The looping time travel element was utilized perfectly, and it just made for a very good episode. Again, the highlight being Kenneth Haig's performance and his clear and concise arc. I guess it would have been nice to have added some type of tangible ticking time bomb component to Mackay's arrival, like somehow Decker had to go back and save him before Mackay arrived. It's clear that he has to save him, but adding that hastening may have made the situation more urgent. Then again, that could have muddled a pretty succinct narrative. Anyway, the last flight is something you should see, so get your head out of the clouds and track it down. It's a worthwhile plane ride through the Twilight Zone. Honestly, I don't really like the Purple Testament very much. I think it's an interesting premise that goes nowhere, and for the first war episode of the Twilight Zone, it's a bit of a letdown. It is notable for a few reasons though, like how the star and director of this episode both almost died in a plane crash the night it was supposed to air. I'll explain in a bit. It's 1945 and US troops are stationed in the Philippine Islands. Lieutenant William Fitzgerald just returned from a mission where 4 of his men were killed. His friend, Captain Phil Riker, notices this is affecting him in a way he hasn't seen before. Fitzgerald has lost soldiers in the past, but something about this particular incident has spooked the lieutenant. Fitzgerald goes on to explain that he knew those men were going to die because he saw it in their faces beforehand. Literally. He has inexplicably gained the ability to sense who around him is about to die. We see this ability through the eyes of the lieutenant as the person's face lighting up. When he tells this to Riker, he of course doesn't believe him. But it happens multiple times afterward until eventually Fitzgerald sees Riker's face light up before they are to head out on a mission together. Already beaten down by a brutal war, word about the lieutenant's supposed power leaks out to the other soldiers as one of them confronts him, asking who among them won't make it back from their next assignment. Before we get into anything, yes, that is Darren from Bewitched, and yes, I love that!
We'll drink to an illusion, to a couple of coincidences. Now that's it, Fitz. I'll see you at the trucks.
It's pretty good, huh?
Dick York is actually the best part of the episode. The guy just had a natural charisma, and since most people know him as a comedic actor, this is a piece of work that really showed off his range.
Gunther thinks you'd be better off with 3 weeks back at Division. I agree with him. Now, this thing won't take more than a few hours, but it'll be messy.
He would show up on one more Twilight Zone episode in Season 2's A Penny for Your Thoughts. I kind of wish his character was the lead in this because between him and William Reynolds' Lieutenant Fitzgerald, the Riker character was just more interesting to watch. All due respect to Reynolds, because he took over this role at the last minute and later admitted he didn't have much time to add any subtext to his performance. It was so quick that he only had time to learn the lines and present a very basic delivery.
You're a perceptive man, Phil. It's a mark of a good officer, isn't it?
You might put tape over my eyes or poke them out and do something I won't be able to see. So I won't have to look at any more faces.
The more intriguing story with William Reynolds actually happened in real life. On the day this installment was to originally air, he and the director of this episode, Richard Baer, were on their way back from shooting a pilot for the TV show The Islanders, when their plane crashed into the ocean. The wreck killed one person on board and injured more. As Reynolds tells the story, once the news reached Buck Houghton and Rod Serling, they pulled that night's debut of The Purple Testament out of concern for the actor and his family, something Reynolds was always grateful for. However, there is some debate as to if the episode actually did air that night or not. In any case, it makes for a significant footnote about this installment of the show. The episode meanders along for a while before Fitzgerald sees that Riker has the look of death on him. The captain refuses to heed his friend's warning, and when they exit the tent, Fitzgerald is asked head-on by one of the soldiers who's going to die on this mission.
Come on, Lieutenant. Now look, it ain't fair. You know who's going to get it. Who is it? Knock it off, Freeman.
With everyone on edge, Fitzgerald is forced to denounce the rumor that he has this power. However, when they return, we hear that Riker was the only man killed as they came under unexpected sniper fire. He was a well-liked man, and the soldiers mourn him.
2 fine sons. Man, war stinks.
Well, that's one way of putting it. He's then informed he's supposed to report back to Division so the medics can properly look him over as he's to be given a few weeks' rest. But before he leaves, he catches his own face in a mirror. He sees the light again when it appears upon the face of his driver. They leave after being warned of some possible enemy landmines, and soon after, an explosion is heard in the distance. I feel like for such an extraordinary concept in the middle of World War II, The Purple Testament failed to deliver anything different than any other basic war movie or story. And that's a shame, because the potential was there. Fitzgerald does next to nothing with his power other than resign to its inevitability. There's not much beneath the surface on this one besides the basic mantra that war is bad, and seeing so many friends and fellow soldiers die over and over again is something that's basically out of your control in that type of situation. The character interactions aren't too bad, especially when Dick York is on screen, but The Purple Testament isn't an episode I'd go out of my way to rewatch. No, this one is best left inside the Twilight Zone. Elegy is one of those episodes that sticks with you for its blend of sci-fi and morbid/gleeful horror. Out of all the stories from the original series, this is definitely among the most memorable for me. The feeling I was left with after watching it for the first time was just unsettling, especially with how they orchestrated the tone of the ending. It was written by Charles Beaumont and based on his 1953 short story of the same name. Douglas Hayes returned to direct the second of his 9 episodes to air, and it stars Jeff Morrow, Kevin Hagen, Don Dubbins, and 2-time Academy Award nominee Cecil Kellaway. Carl Myers, James Webber, and Peter Kirby are astronauts that have been lost in space since a meteor shower knocked out some of their navigation equipment 6 months ago, that being in September of 2185. They land on an asteroid said to be 655 million miles away from the Earth. They're surprised to see the asteroid has a breathable atmosphere and even looks like Earth did 200 years prior. But the most bizarre distinction of this floating rock are the people. They stand posed as if they're living a regular day of life, but don't move or respond to anything the astronauts do. They walk throughout this small town, confused to see more and more people in the same state until a man named Jeremy Wickwire comes alive to welcome them to his house. The truth of what's really going on is even more strange than the trio could imagine. The creep factor of this episode is off the charts. The scenes of these rooms filled with people who don't move are just plain freaky. And yes, since they use real actors who had to remain still, it's not perfect. Small movements are visible in almost every sequence they're in, but it's not too distracting, and I'm glad they went with real people instead of mannequins or dummies. Director Douglas Hayes planned a strategy to minimize the noticeable twitches of his actors by constantly moving the camera. It works sometimes, but outside of that purpose, I love those shots. It really gives a sense of scale to the environments and helps make the look of the episode more distinct. Hayes also made a big decision by replacing the auto race scene that was in the original short story with the beauty pageant sequence. He thought the former wouldn't translate well to the screen and looked too much like parked cars. Charles Beaumont was said to be upset with this change, but for a lot of people, the pageant scene is one of the more memorable parts of the episode. The acting here, while not the centerpiece, is pretty good. All 3 leads have defining characteristics that make them view this situation from slightly different perspectives. The mystery of what this place is carries their reactions to believable expressions of confusion and frustration, specifically when dealing with Mr. Wickwire.
Now I understand.
Well, that's nice. We don't.
This is one of my favorite twists, so I'm giving you some extra warning here. I think you should check this out if you haven't seen it before. Believe me, it's worth it. Through their conversation with Wickwire, we hear that the astronauts are out of fuel and have to stay on the asteroid. There's also more background information that comes out about the state of the Earth.
Did they ever have that atomic war?
Yes, in 1985. Most of the Earth's surface was destroyed, and it's taken us 200 years to pick up the pieces.
After that, we finally find out what this place is.
Where are we?
Why, you're in a cemetery.
Apparently, this was an extension of Earth's greatest mortuary called Happy Glades, where after death, the rich can be embalmed and placed into their greatest fantasy forever.
In other words, this is the place where your dreams come true after you've stopped dreaming.
Opened in 1973, only a select few on the asteroid are actually dead. The rest are called human imitations. Mr. Wickwire then reveals himself as a scientific device that only turns on when needed, and he hasn't been activated in around 200 years.
Happy Glades promises eternal peace, everlasting peace. You couldn't have that on Earth, now could you?
Earlier, he gave them wine to toast with that is revealed to actually be eternifying fluid, an embalmer that kills its ingester and makes them like the other people on the asteroid.
I told you not to trust him! I told you!
When Myers asks why he's done this to them, Wickwire responds it's because they've disturbed the everlasting peace of the dead on the asteroid, and also because they are men.
And while there are men, there can be no peace.
Before their deaths, Wickwire asked the trio what their dearest wish would be. All 3 answered to be on their ship heading for home, and that's exactly where we see them after they're dead. Wickwire poses them on their spacecraft as if they're about to take off. He nonchalantly dusts them before returning to his home to deactivate. And that's how this episode ends. What a macabre, horrifying finish. The astronauts are murdered and their bodies posed like wax figures forever. And the thing that really puts this over the top is the goofy, lighthearted music they play while Wickwire dusts their corpses. Good Goodness gracious! Cold-blooded, man. Cold-blooded. The theme of nuclear war and mankind being the cause of its own demise is covered more than a few times in this series, and it's mostly in the background here till the end. Wickwire would make a great movie villain. Think about it, a humanoid artificial intelligence that runs a planet of peacefully placed dead people, a being that believes as long as man lives, there can be no peace. His goal would be a noble one in his own mind, to give us all what we want, but only in death. Someone should make another character like this. What a great idea. Credit to Charles Beaumont for crafting such a motivation, and Douglas Hayes for bringing him to life. This is an obvious recommendation, even if some of the science doesn't make sense, but who cares? Go seek this out and watch it. Elegy is forever frozen in time, and we could take a trip to see it in all its glory whenever we want, inside that living memory that is the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling got the idea for Mirror Image while at an airport in London. Close by, he saw a man of a similar height, wearing the same clothes and even carrying the same luggage. Serling imagined him turning around and seeing his own face. Of course, this didn't happen when the man actually turned around, but it did inspire the premise for this episode. It's become a favorite of many Twilight Zone fans, including Jordan Peele. He cited it as inspiration for his 2019 film Us. The concept of the evil doppelganger has been done quite a bit since this episode aired in 1960, so you could call it a bit of a trendsetter in that regard. Millicent Barnes sits in a bus station waiting on the late arrival of the next transport. After talking to the ticket agent, she realizes something odd is going on. He says she's asked him about when the bus will be along multiple times, but this is the first she's gone up to talk to him. Also, an identical bag to hers has been checked, and the agent says she's the one who checked it. Later in the bathroom, the attendant mentions that Millicent was just inside, but Barnes wasn't in there previously. Then, the unthinkable happens. She sees a double of herself sitting in the lobby through the bathroom mirror. When she goes back out to see, the look-alike is gone. A businessman named Paul then strikes up a conversation with Barnes as she starts to tell him of her ordeal and her outlandish theory of what and how this might be happening. I know this episode is a favorite of a lot of people and there is a lot to like about it, but I wasn't quite as captivated by this last rewatch. Maybe it's because I've seen this premise done in depth or from more interesting angles in more recent years, but I wasn't as enthralled as I remember being the first time I saw it. That being said, it's still enjoyable and effectively creepy. The setting of a bus station in the middle of a thunderstorm fits the story like a glove. The acting and character work is serviceable while definitely keeping you interested. I actually think my favorite character is the grumpy old ticket agent.
You're either walking in your sleep or hungover or something. Go back over there and sit down and breathe through your nose and let me read my magazine. I'm shutting off some of these lights. When not in use, turn off the juice. That's what I always say. I'd say she's got a leak in her attic. You got a thing about sick people? Is that it?
Vera Miles is known for a few big roles from this time period, including her turn as Lila Crane in Psycho. Her confused expressions and general disposition of perplexity work well. We're right there with her on this journey of bewilderment as her own sanity is starting to come into question.
I've been seeing things.
What sort of things?
I'm not sure I should tell you. You probably want to move to another part of the room or call the police or an ambulance or something.
Martin Milner as Paul is a pretty straightforward character. He feels sorry for Millicent and listens to her story. There's a very small hint of a romance between the two, but it's not explored beyond maybe one line.
You're very kind.
Forget it. You're easy to be kind, too.
No, I mean more than just kind. We better get on the bus.
Some of the visuals here definitely help establish the creepy vibe, with one of the more recognizable Twilight Zone shots being this one, where Millicent first sees her double. Since 99% of the episode is inside the bus station, there's nothing too exciting the crew could do with the camera, but I think that works to its advantage, luring us into a sense of bland normality that's broken by glimpses of the strange and unusual. Also, I'm not sure if this was intentional, but either way, that's even more creepy. As they're boarding the bus, Millicent sees her doppelganger again and faints. Paul waits with her as they miss the transport and will have to wait until 7 a.m. for the next one. After she awakens, Miss Barnes explains what she thinks might be happening concerning her double popping up all night.
I remember reading it somewhere. Each of us has a twin in this other world. Two parallel worlds that exist side by side. After the two worlds converge, comes into our world, and in order to survive, it has to take over. Replace us. Move us out so that it can live. I can't explain it. But I know that's what's happened.
Reluctantly, Paul ends up calling the police so Millicent can be taken to get some psychiatric help. Saddened by her seemingly warped state of mind, he plans on staying the night at the bus station. But soon, he sees that his briefcase is missing. A man then sprints out of the station with Paul racing behind. We see that man is his own double as he disappears into the night, leaving Paul frantic.
Hey! Where are you?
It's a spooky ending. Seeing Paul's double smile back at him as he runs just out of reach is a bit unsettling. Also, the effect they use here doesn't look too bad for the time. I do think the over-explanation given by Millicent is sort of out of nowhere, though. I feel like there could have been a simpler or more organic way to work that theory into the script, but as is, Mirror Image is a pretty strong, memorable episode of the show. John Brom directed its pacing as deliberate, and it seems like they relied more on the natural atmosphere than music for a majority of the story, so it felt a bit different from what was seen up until this point in the first season. It may not be perfect in my eyes, but it should be on your must-watch list if you're making your way through the well-known episodes of the series. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is a seminal episode of The Twilight Zone. It is highly influential and has been performed as stage plays, a radio drama, and was even remade in 2003. Rod Serling was known as a highly political and socially conscious writer before creating The Twilight Zone. He was constantly stopped from writing stories about more serious issues by executives and sponsors. He created the series in part to have the platform to write about those issues under the guise of science fiction and fantasy. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street may be the most obvious example of Serling tackling a bigger subject matter through the use of a more wild premise. Late in the afternoon one summer day, a large, bright light in the sky with an accompanying strange sound passes over the suburban avenue of Maple Street. The residents wave it off as a meteor, but soon after, they notice that all electronics, including lights and cars, are no longer functioning. Tommy, a boy who lives in the neighborhood, convinces everyone on the block that he's heard of this happening before in science fiction stories he's been reading. In those stories, aliens send down a few of their own to infiltrate the population. They look human, but are in disguise. Quickly, this theory starts to permeate the street, and soon enough, they're all accusing each other of being alien monsters who are responsible for what's happening with the electricity. No one is above suspicion, as the once tranquil suburban neighborhood starts to turn on itself. Despite the supernatural concept, the social commentary here is very surface level. Serling was likely influenced by McCarthyism and the blacklisting that went on in the 1950s, but sadly, this is still a relevant episode today. Throughout the runtime, people keep turning on each other without evidence in an increasingly dangerous blind witch hunt. This had a bigger cast than the series usually featured, and the acting here is pretty good. Claude Atkins and Jack Weston are the standouts for different reasons. Atkins as Steve is the voice of reason in a believable performance.
You're all standing out here, all set to crucify somebody. You're all desperate to point some kind of a finger at a neighbor.
The only thing that's going to happen is that we're going to eat each other up alive.
For his part as Charlie, Weston is basically the embodiment of fear. In a lot of cases, he's the one who worsens the situation the most. He also has a natural comedic delivery, so that comes through a few times as well.
No, it's nothing of the sort. I didn't know the lights on. I swear I didn't. Somebody's pulling a gag or something.
Barry Atwater plays Les, the first man accused of having something to do with a power outage. His car starts by itself, and his neighbors are quick to jump on him. Atwater has a bit of an odd delivery here, which may have been meant to create some sort of suspicion, but you definitely feel sorry for him during the ordeal.
We aren't any different from you, any different at all. The whole thing is just weird.
One of the women then accuses him of looking up at the stars late at night, as if he's waiting for something.
We heard what I said. I said it was insomnia. You scared, frightened rabbits, you. You're sick people, do you know that?
The tension grows and grows until things turn violent. When a dark figure is seen walking toward the skittish group, most of them immediately consider it a threat, to the point where little Tommy thinks it's the monster he warned them about, and a gun is brought into the equation. Despite Steve's attempts to calm the situation, Charlie takes it from his hands and shoots the figure dead. It's revealed to be a neighbor of theirs named Pete Van Horn. Earlier in the episode, he went to another street to check if the power was still on there. Angry over the killing and seeing that the lights in his home are flickering, the group turns on Charlie and stones his house, injuring him in the process. Charlie distracts suspicion by saying Tommy is the alien. He is the only person who knew about the plot the whole time. From there, things devolve into total chaos. Lights are flickering all over the neighborhood as an all-out mob is formed. Guns are fired, bricks are thrown, and total madness reigns. On a hilltop overlooking the city, we see two aliens surveying the damage.
Throw them into darkness for a few hours and then sit back and watch the pattern. Their world is full of maple streets. And we'll go from one to the other and let them destroy themselves.
With that, they fly off, and the episode ends. By the way, that ending shot and the alien costumes are again from the film Forbidden Planet. The shot is actually reversed and shown upside down. So by the end, I think this episode is brilliant. It still holds up, it's still relevant, and all the quick cuts of the chaos happening towards the finish was a great choice from director Ronald Winston. However, I don't like the beginning of this episode, specifically the Tommy kid.
They sent 4 people, a mother and a father and 2 kids who looked just like humans, but they weren't.
So I'm supposed to buy into this big-mouthed little kid influencing a whole neighborhood super easily because he memorized the plot to a couple science fiction stories? That is incredibly weak, even with the ship, which they thought was a meteor passing overhead and the power out. There couldn't have been a slightly more believable way to script bringing that concept into the story. I get what it's saying about how easily and quickly we can all turn on each other, but there's nothing about how this initial incident was executed that had me buying into all this happening. And the fact that the people who listen to Tommy don't go outside the neighborhood to check on things, including Steve, because what the kid said freaked them out, is a leap in logic bigger than the actual aliens at the end. I think the pacing here is just too quick. They started accusing each other of being an alien monster a little too fast for my taste. If it built up to that slower, or we had some kind of clue to point the characters in that direction, I wouldn't have had an issue with it. And again, it still turns out great in the end, but on this last rewatch, I couldn't help but notice how thin that motivation was at the beginning. Okay, I had to get that off my chest. I know most people will disagree with me, and that's fine. I still think this is an iconic episode for a reason, but I had to say that. Rod's ending narration here is one of his best.
Prejudices can kill, and suspicion can destroy. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to the Twilight Zone.
Funnily enough, according to Mark Zickry's The Twilight Zone companion book, ahead of this episode's release, Serling was misquoted by several papers, including the Miami Herald. The false quote said this episode was his commentary that the minorities always need a scapegoat to explain their own weaknesses. That's pretty bad. It seems like Rod's point about prejudices in the real world was made for him even before this episode aired. It really is too bad that things like that don't only exist in the Twilight Zone. I love A World of Difference. Written by Richard Matheson and directed by Ted Post, the episode features a fantastic premise executed flawlessly. There's a variance in locations, really great performances, some remarkable visuals, and it's just a really well-told story that leaves you questioning what really happened in the end. Arthur Curtis is a businessman about to take a long postponed vacation with his wife. On his last day at work, he interacts with his secretary before going into his office to discover his phone is not working. In the background, he hears someone yell "cut," and we see one of the walls is now missing to reveal a film crew. These people think Arthur Curtis is actually Jerry Reagan, an alcoholic star actor whose career is in freefall. He's speechless to see he's in the middle of a soundstage and that Arthur Curtis is just a character Reagan is playing in his latest movie. Trying to escape, he runs into Reagan's wife Nora. They're in the middle of a bitter divorce, and she's demanding Jerry sign off on the money she's to receive. He takes her car with Nora inside and tries to find his home, but can't. It doesn't exist. In fact, his wife, daughter, place of work, everything seems to not be real. But they are written into the script of the movie Jerry's been acting in. With more and more terrible details about Reagan's life uncovered at every turn, Arthur becomes even more confused as everyone around tries to convince him that he's living a delusion. Let's talk about Howard Duff's performance as Arthur Curtis before we get into anything else. The layers of emotion that character goes through would be a lot for any actor to handle, but Duff pulls it off effortlessly. There was never a moment where I didn't buy his performance. His delivery is great, but I think he especially shines in his non-verbal acting. He has this naturally confused expression that makes him look like a lost little kid. It's all in the eyes and eyebrows. It's very subtle at times, but that really enhances his work as the character. As time passes, he gets increasingly frustrated with this bizarre situation. The pressure of Jerry Reagan's life weighs heavy on Arthur Curtis, but when he keeps finding out detail by detail that his world is seemingly not real, it leads to several breakdowns.
I'd like to have the telephone number of the Davis Morton Company.
Of course there is! I worked there! I've worked there for the last 7 years!
Marion Curtis, 33. Can manage a house and family and still have ample...
Stop it!
David White plays Jerry's agent, Brinkley, with a convincing amount of sympathy. His role wasn't huge in this episode, but his presence definitely improved it.
Jerry, sometimes I'd like to escape myself, away from this turmoil, to some simpler existence.
Another standout performance was Eileen Ryan as Jerry's soon-to-be ex-wife, Nora. The venom she spews out for her entire time on screen is something to see, and very well done.
G-E-R-A-L-D-R-A-I-G-A-N! That's not my name!
She's really easy to buy into as this character. Ryan is also the mother of Sean Penn, and after I found that out, the resemblance is assuredly noticeable. Another quick familial fact, Howard Duff was married to Ida Lupino, the star and director of 2 Twilight Zone episodes herself. Big credit goes to director Ted Post and cinematographer Harkness Smith for setting up and executing some beautiful shots. Apparently, there were some behind-the-scenes issues with regular cinematographer George T. Clemens and Post. They had worked together before, and Clemens didn't want to do so again on Twilight Zone, despite Serling wanting Post to direct a few episodes. Eventually, Clemens went on vacation and Post was brought in for this installment. He also directed 3 other episodes later in the series. But as for a world of difference, foreground, background, and dramatic lighting elements make this my favorite shot of the whole episode.
Ventnor. V-E-N-T-N-E-R.
Just before that, the reveal of the film crew was impressively accomplished. Supposedly, the wall was on rails so it could move as quickly and efficiently as possible. That whole scene, up until that point, happens in one shot and it looks great. Everything about the following few minutes in the studio is just so cool to me. I love how it looks, and I love how it plays out. Later, this sequence of Reagan's car speeding through traffic is amazing, effectively building intensity as things ramp up in the final act. Special shout out to Van Cleve for a badass, heart-pumping, and really weird soundtrack. The music is exceptionally strong in this episode. When Jerry's agent tells Arthur they're tearing down the set of his office, he speeds to the studio for one last-ditch effort of returning home. When he arrives, he sits in his chair, distraught.
Don't leave me here. Don't leave me here.
The room transforms around him and Arthur seems to be home. His wife greets him as they leave early for their vacation, but not before hearing voices in the distance.
All right, let's get those lamps and tables out of here.
After Arthur rushes his wife out, we cut back to Jerry's world, where his agent searches for him. We then hold on the title of the script. It reads, The Private World of Arthur Curtis. We see a plane take off as Serling's closing narration mentions Curtis somehow escaped reality. But which reality was the original? It's not explicitly stated, but I'd guess more people would say Jerry Reagan was the real persona. The evidence kind of points to that. Remember my favorite looking scene? Well, it also holds a possible clue about what might be real and what might not be.
Don't listen, it's my own home. I'm Arthur Curtis. I can't seem to remember it at the moment, will you?
He can't remember his own phone number. That also matches up with what his agent says later at Jerry's home.
The only information you have about Arthur Curtis is written in this script.
But earlier, right before Curtis discovers he's on a film set, he seems to know someone's number just prior to discovering the phone's not working. Very tricky indeed. I love those little details. As for my official take on the matter, I think Curtis is the real persona. He mentions in the first scene he hasn't taken a vacation in years. This could be some kind of fantasy his mind conjured up by overworking for so long. Jerry Reagan may represent his job and how he can't escape those problems and responsibilities. He has to let go of that to finally go on vacation. The other way around of Reagan being the real person is just a little too simple for me. An actor whose personal and professional life is falling apart retreats to a fantasy world created by a role he plays. There he has a loving wife and daughter and a more stress-free home life. The director seemed to think of it as a man with schizophrenia who doesn't know what's real, which would lean more toward Reagan being the true personality, but what do you think? Reagan or Curtis? Who's real? Who's fantasy? Or is it a case of parallel worlds crossing over? I want to hear your theories. Leave a comment below or send me your opinion on Twitter. I look forward to the discussion. A World of Difference is an overlooked and underappreciated episode, but it shouldn't be that way. If you check it out, I think you'll agree. Richard Matheson gave us an excellent little piece of work to talk about in or out of the Twilight Zone. Long Live Walter Jameson is an expertly understated story that puts realistic implications onto its extraordinary premise. Charles Beaumont wrote this episode, and his trademark darker leanings are evident in its underlying themes and principles. It also featured some clever makeup effects by William Tuttle that hold up incredibly well. While shooting this episode, The Twilight Zone finally debuted on TV. It was a bit of a slow go for a while, but it eventually became a mainstay for CBS. Critics immediately loved it, and it curiously gained favor with a very young audience. All of their hard work was riding on the reception of the debut episode, but that obviously didn't affect their work with this production, as it's a quality entry in the series for several reasons. College history professor Walter Jameson is a captivating lecturer with uncanny, in-depth knowledge of the subject he teaches. His friend and colleague Sam Kittredge has a daughter named Susanna that Walter is engaged to. Kittredge invites Jameson to his house for dinner, where they have a long gestating conversation about Walter's background, including a question Sam has been apprehensively anxious to ask. Just how old is Walter Jameson? Most famously known for his starring role in the classic 1956 sci-fi horror film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Kevin McCarthy plays Walter Jameson in this episode with the subtle gravitas needed to pull off such a mysterious and weighty role.
Let me read you a few extracts from the diary of Major Skelton. The date is Tuesday, September 11th, 1864. Sherman was drunk with victory. He himself started the awful fires. The fires that destroyed that great citadel of grace and beauty.
He's a very enigmatic presence in the first half of the episode, as his tit-for-tat conversations with Sam about marrying his daughter bring a real captivating aspect to their back and forth.
All right, I'm 51. Too old for Susanna, is that it?
In a sense.
The fact that they're playing chess just ups the atmosphere. The conversation then turns to aging in general, after Sam starts comparing his degrading features to that of Walter.
In 12 short years, I've turned into an old man, while you haven't aged at all.
Edgar Staley plays Sam Kittredge with such a great sense of intelligence. He had a full career into his old age, and was even on the Tales of Tomorrow episode, What You Need, which we covered in our review of the Twilight Zone version. Here, he wants his friend to know that he's onto him. Sam circles Jameson before bringing out some evidence that may prove Walter is not who he says he is. There are two big reveals in this episode, so we're getting to the twist section with a lot more story to explain. Sam shows Walter a picture of the Civil War major that he read the diary of in his history class. Jameson looks exactly like him, down to the ring he wears and mole on his face. At first, Walter denies it, but Sam is persistent, especially since this is the guy that's about to marry his daughter.
You and I have been very close for 12 years. You are that man in the photograph, aren't you?
Yes.
Walter is over 2,000 years old. Long ago, his fear of death was so great that he paid an alchemist to experiment on him. After being in a coma for many weeks, he awoke alone, but from that point on, he no longer aged. Then we hear about his regrets. Walter has had to watch all those around him die, including his own children. An old man himself, Sam envies Jameson, but the history professor who lived through the subject he's teaching says it's not all it's cracked up to be.
It's death that gives this world its point. We love a rose because we know it'll soon be gone.
Walter says he's lived for so long that he wants to die, but lacks the courage to end his own life. He's had many close calls over the centuries, but death never came.
I thought if a man lived forever, he'd grow wiser. But that isn't true, is it?
You just go on living, that's all.
From here, Sam's concern turns to his daughter. He knows that Walter has been married many times and doesn't want Susanna to see her husband leave when she becomes too old. Apparently, Walter tried to resign and move away 6 months prior because he could tell Susanna was falling in love with him. It was Sam who convinced him to stay, and now, despite all his experiences, Jameson can't bring himself to leave the girl.
I can't let you marry my daughter.
And why not?
Against Sam's wishes, Walter tells Susanna that they're getting married tonight. He'll return in 15 minutes to pick her up. Earlier, we saw an elderly woman spying on Walter, and after he heads home, Jameson is confronted by her in his house. This is his last wife, Lorette. She knows him as Tommy Bowman, and saw his new engagement picture that was in the paper.
Now you're going to marry someone else, and leave her the way you left me. I can't let you marry her, Tommy. You're mine.
She then grabs the revolver Walter keeps in his desk.
Tommy, it's wrong. You can't go on hurting people.
Walter is shot and Lorette leaves. Sam enters the house after hearing the noise across the street. He arrives to see Walter rapidly aging. Jameson seems to be welcoming his fate.
Nothing lasts forever. Thank God.
Susanna comes in to investigate, and although her father tries to keep her from the site, she sees Walter's empty suit, dust, where his body once was.
Dad, what is that on the floor?
Dust. Only dust.
The episode ends there with the long overdue and merciful death of Walter Jameson. Estelle Winwood played Lorette with an almost sympathetic demeanor. She kind of picks up on the fact that her Tommy is wary of his unnaturally long life and ends it when he couldn't. That mix of sympathy, revenge, and protection of any future woman he might leave made for an appropriate example of Walter's long history finally coming back to bite him. The acting across the board here was really good, and the slow story pacing and minimal setup made this a focused, engaging watch. The director, Anton Leader, credited here as Tony Leader, would return for one more episode in the 3rd season. Probably the most memorable and impressive part of this installment are the aging effects. The first one, showing the age lines appear on McCarthy's face, are amazing. They accomplished this by applying red makeup and lighting the scene with the same color. To reveal the full look, they switched the lighting to green, which brought out the appearance of instant aging. Of course, this is really only effective in black and white, but it looks so good. It's an example of the effective ingenuity that can be accomplished through practical effects. This technique was used before in other big film projects of the time period and still looks great today. The other 2 makeup stages were made with a life cast of McCarthy's face and also look pretty convincing, but it's that first stage that's the most stunning. Credit to the makeup department, specifically William Tuttle, for their amazing work. Long Live Walter Jameson is a high-grade, Charles Beaumont-written episode of the show. You should definitely check it out when you have some time. Although, time works a little differently in the Twilight Zone. People Are Alike All Over stars a young Roddy McDowall and is based on the 1952 short story Brothers Beyond the Void by Paul W. Fairman. There are some changes that Rod Serling made in this adaptation, but most of the basics are seemingly intact. In the production order, this episode was made very close to Third from the Sun and used most of the same sets, to the point where it was kind of distracting, honestly. This was also the third and final episode that aired, directed by Mitchell Leisen. It isn't a bad one and has a classic twist at the end, but the 16mm Shrine is by far this director's best episode. As for People Are Alike All Over, it feels a little thin to fill up an entire 25 minutes, but the core idea and moral of the story, if you want to call it that, fits the show's brand very well. Two astronauts named Sam Conrad and Warren Markison look on at a rocket they are to take off in the next morning. Markison is very optimistic and hopes to meet an intelligent form of life when they get to their destination, Mars. People are alike all over, he says, no matter where humanoid life can exist. Conrad is much more skittish and fears meeting life on the Red Planet. The next day, they are jettisoned from Earth and on their way. Unfortunately, they travel 35 million miles to have a very rough landing. The ship is heavily damaged and Markison is fatally wounded. Conrad is unharmed and tries to help his colleague, but Markison wants to see the planet before he dies. Sam refuses to open the door, fearing what or who is on the other side. Warren then succumbs to his wounds before the door is opened from the outside. Conrad is shocked to see people, humans, waiting for him. These Martians have psychic abilities and seem good-natured. He has an especially pleasant connection with a female named Tina who reassures him. They offer to help bury Markison, repair the ship, and give Conrad a familiar place to stay the following day. Using images from Sam's mind, the house they build for him is a perfect recreation of one from Earth. Sam Conrad feels right at home, but things may not be as perfect as he thinks. It's cool seeing Roddy McDowall here, and he does a decent job as the innocent, frightened Sam Conrad. Some of his line deliveries are a little on the nose, but it feels like that was more the writing than his acting. I also can't help but hear the Mad Hatter in a few scenes.
Will you tell the others how very appreciative I am? I was so frightened.
Actually, the prototype isn't quite ready yet.
Paul Comey was fine in his smaller role as Markison, and Susan Oliver played her part as Tina passably, but the MVP of this episode is Vic Perrin as one of the male Martians. His constant, affectionate looks to his bromance buddy will win your heart. The toga-type things they got going on for the Martians feel a bit off, but I guess they're supposed to be presented as a more advanced society, which means they dress like John Belushi in Animal House. I will say I like the spaceship footage and transition they used from the surface of Mars to the mangled interior of Conrad's rocket. Those shots and that set were supposedly from this season's favorite movie, say it with me, Forbidden Planet. Anyway, I really liked how the spaceship interior was set up after the crash. The slanted position of everything made it all feel more tangible, and how it was shot made that scene look great. Conrad enjoys his new home for a while before realizing there are no windows or ways to escape the locked house. A wall then opens to reveal a group of Martians on the outside looking in at him through bars. Sam notices a sign that reads Earth Creature in his native habitat. He's in a zoo! As a guilty-looking Tina leaves, Conrad is left with a disturbing irony.
Markison, you were right!
People are alike everywhere.
This ending was foreshadowed at the beginning, when we see both Conrad and Markison looking through a fence at the rocket. A rocket that would take one to his death, and the other to life as a living exhibit. Overall, this episode was okay, nothing all that special or must-see about it. The theme of people will always be awful no matter where they exist in the universe feels similar to other Rod Serling scripts. I can see why he was attracted to the short story. Martians may not look like humans or wear togas, but who knows? Maybe they do. In the Twilight Zone. Execution was adapted by Rod Serling from George Clayton Johnson's unpublished short story. It features time travel from the Old West, some great stunts, solid cinematography, an appearance by the professor from Gilligan's Island, and a pretty good performance from Albert Selmy. The concept had the potential to give us a really good script, but I believe it falls a little short in that area. It may have been told better in the original short story since there were several significant changes by Serling. Regardless, there's definitely no shortage of things to discuss about this episode. It's the year 1880, and criminal Joe Caswell is about to be hung for murder. But when the execution begins, he mysteriously disappears. 80 years into the future, a scientist named Professor Mannion is shown tending to his subject. He just successfully made Caswell the world's first time traveler. Hoping to integrate him into modern-day New York City proves to be a difficult task, though. The professor almost instantly distrusts the outlaw after noticing the rope burns on his neck. This leads to a confrontation that will affect the past, present, and future. I gotta admit, it was a bit surreal seeing the professor himself playing another professor in this episode. Russell Johnson would go on to Gilligan's Island a few years after this, so let's pretend this character changed his name before boarding the SS Minnow and getting stranded.
You're a long way from home, old friend. A very long way.
Johnson would make his second and final Zone appearance in the Season 2 episode Back There. Too bad he doesn't play another professor in that story. But the same director of Execution, David Orrick McDearman, directed Back There as well. Heck, he even directed 2 episodes of Gilligan's Island. Next fanscription, what if Gilligan's Island took place in the Twilight Zone? Anyway, Johnson is fine here as the professor, but by far the most interesting character and performance is Albert Salmi as Joe Caswell. He's got a very unbalanced attitude throughout the whole runtime. Sending him to the future has made him even more unpredictable and dangerous.
When you're dangling at the end of a rope, it don't matter whether you're 1 foot off the ground or 100.
You killed someone.
A whole territory full. I stopped counting after 20. I died once already, mister. I've been to hell. Now I'm back.
It's really quite a magnetic presentation Salmi shows off here. He'd make 2 other appearances for the series, but this is probably his best work in the Twilight Zone. The tension builds between Caswell and Mannion until the unpredictable man out of time snaps.
You come out in your warm trains rolling over the graves of men like me. I just hate your kind!
Caswell runs into the modern world, scared and threatening. He's overwhelmed by all the noise, bright lights, and people. The cowboy causes several disturbances, including shooting someone in a car that almost hits him and returns to the professor's laboratory. Mannion seems to be dead from Caswell's earlier assault, and that's when an armed thief named Paul Johnson shows up to rob the place. They get into a scuffle where Johnson kills Caswell by choking him with a curtain cord. Looking for a safe, he accidentally activates the time machine and is transported back to Caswell's prior location, hanging dead on the end of a rope. The people present in 1880 are baffled, and they carry off Johnson's dead body as the episode finishes. So it seems totally out of nowhere to add the modern thief character to a story that was so driven by Salmi's performance as Caswell. I guess he still gets his comeuppance by being strangled with what's basically a rope, but having this random character go back and take his place felt a little too much like reaching to have a more shocking ending. In the original story, Caswell is shot by a policeman and appears back in the Old West in the noose he disappeared in. Predictable? Yes. A better ending than what we got here? Yes. There's also a big leap in logic that bugged the crap out of me when Caswell stumbles into a bar in NYC. After destroying a jukebox, he demands a drink from the bartender by placing his gun on the bar. He takes a drink, turns around, and asks the bartender questions about the modern appliances, all while the gun just sits there. He isn't even facing forward half the time. Why couldn't the bartender just take the gun? This guy just broke his jukebox and is holding him up for alcohol. He's the most understanding bartender I've ever seen.
Buddy, why don't you go home and sack down, huh? Take a couple of bottles with you. That's what you need, is sleep. Here, take these home with you.
I know he's just trying to get him out of the bar without being shot, but then he even explains television to him.
Here, we'll give you a demonstration, huh?
And only after Caswell shoots the TV does the bartender feel the need to call for the police.
All right, cowboy, you gotta pay for this. Police! Police!
I could see that scene working if it was shown to us in a different way, but how it is here is just poorly executed. No pun intended. I love how the city looks in this episode. It seems extra bright, loud, and busy. Anything to enhance the effect it's having on Caswell. The shots they went with here work perfectly to that extent. They even throw in a few from The Four of Us Are Dying. Outside of Salmi's menacingly manic turn as the outlaw, my favorite thing about this episode was some of the stunt work. Check out how the stuntman for the professor lands after being thrown over his desk. Ouch! That looked like it had to hurt being folded up like that, but it looks great. The lamp shattering on impact looks awesome too. Salmi seemed to do some of his own stunts in this episode that range from dodging close calls with moving cars to breaking through a phone booth. While there is a second window break in the well-choreographed fight with the other thief, that does look to be a stuntman shattering the glass with his back. Bottom line is, I like the action in this episode. Too bad it seemed to bungle the story a bit, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have some impressive aspects. I'd say it's just barely worth recommending to see Albert Salmi's performance. Execution is a Man Out of Time story taken in a darker direction, and as we all know, there's more than just north, south, east, and west when you travel to the Twilight Zone. I really like The Big Tall Wish. It's sentimental without being too sappy, and shows off some fantastic performances, especially from the lead, Ivan Dixon. Outside of stories focused on race, it was rare to see an all-black cast on a TV episode in 1960, and that was something Rod Serling was very aware of. According to Mark Zickry's The Twilight Zone companion book, Serling was quoted at the time speaking of the need to highlight black performers. Quote, "Television, like its big sister, the motion picture, has been guilty of the sin of omission. Hungry for talent, desperate for the so-called new face, constantly searching for a transfusion of new blood, it has overlooked a source of wondrous talent that resides under its nose." End quote. So it's a trendsetter for that reason, but outside of that, it's a strong installment of the show and one of my favorites in the first season. I do think the ending message gets a little muddled, but it all depends on your point of view. We'll discuss that in a bit. An aging boxer named Boley Jackson is friends with a neighborhood boy named Henry and his mom, Frances. He has a big fight coming up that night as he's trying to make a comeback to prominence. Henry tells the boxer that he's going to make a big tall wish that he wins this fight. Later, when warming up in his locker room, Boley finds out that a member of his team, Thomas, has bet against him and refuses to disclose a scouting report on Jackson's opponent. Boley is furious and goes to punch Thomas, but breaks his hand on the wall instead. Because of that, the fight goes poorly and Jackson is knocked out early on. That is, until the impossible happens. Suddenly, Boley is the one standing, and his opponent lie defeated on the canvas. Boley is the only one who remembers breaking his hand and losing the fight. When he speaks to young Henry about this whole situation, Jackson is asked to believe in something that he can't wrap his head around. It can't be overstated how strong of a performance Ivan Dixon turned in as Boley Jackson. He's so believable in a type of role that has been done quite a bit in film and TV. The down-on-his-luck underdog fighter has pretty much become a trope at this point, but that formula, for whatever reason, often works, and since this is the Twilight Zone, we do get a bit of a magical angle on the story of that character archetype. However, Dixon keeps his side of things grounded, convincing, and sympathetic.
A fighter don't need a scrapbook, Henry. You read it in his face. He's got the whole story cut into his flesh.
Rod Serling was actually a boxer in the army, so I'm sure he connected to these fighting stories he wrote quite a bit. There's an authenticity to them that you can't fake, and when you combine his words with Dixon's interpretation of them, you get the perfect mix. What's also special about The Big Tall Wish is Boley's connection with the young Henry. Stephen Perry is pretty darn good as a kid who seems wise beyond his years while retaining the youthful outlook of a child.
You've been hurt enough already, and you're my friend, Boley. You're my good and close friend.
Talks like a little old man, you know. I'm his good and close friend. That's what he tells me.
Boley is obviously on his last legs as a fighter, as we're consistently told how old and broken down he is.
Tired old man trying to catch a bus, and the bus is already gone. Left a couple of years ago.
While this works fine, he's not exactly an old man. Ivan Dixon wasn't even 30 years old when they shot this episode. And yes, in boxing years, even your late 20s can be considered over the hill, but they all act like he's in his 50s or something. That may be because the role was meant for someone older. They actually replaced pro boxer Archie Moore with Dixon when Moore couldn't keep up with the pace of the production. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but that's all the info I could find about it. Moore was almost 15 years older than Dixon, which would have put him in his mid-40s, a much better fit physically for the part. Once Dixon replaced him, I wish they had simply adjusted a few lines. It wouldn't have taken much, but that really is a nitpick considering how high quality this episode is. Ivan Dixon would return for one more appearance in Season 5. Director Ron Winston was at the helm of 2 other Twilight Zone installments, including the heavily praised The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. This one presented its own set of challenges. The boxing match is shown to us in a very clever way. Not able to show an arena full of people or make the call to use probably out-of-place stock footage, Winston made the smart decision to focus on the individuals in the audience. We see close-ups of their hands and some faces reacting to the fight. It turned out to be very effective. The action in the ring is short, but not too bad. I like some of the first-person views we see of Boley falling to the mat. They even have a shot of Dixon laying on a clear surface so the camera can be placed underneath him as the ref counts him out. As long as we're talking about the visuals, this shot of Henry watching the fight at home is a standout moment. At this point, Boley is about to lose the fight and Henry is desperate to see his friend get up and succeed. I love the light that TV casts and the reflection of Henry we see on the screen. Stephen Perry embodies the raw hopes of a child in that instant. Winston was said to be very good with sentimentality and not overdoing it. I think he did a great job of directing that balance with his actors and the tone of the overall piece. What helps guide our emotions in the background is a great score by Jerry Goldsmith. There's a particular focus on harmonicas in this installment, and they work well to convey the mood. The music doesn't take over the episode or become more memorable than the story we're watching, though. It just provides us with certain cues that enhance some of the scenes and performances. After the odd occurrence of Boley winning the fight when he remembers otherwise, he returns home to talk with Henry. Congratulations turn to confusion when Henry reluctantly seems to also remember Boley losing. The fighter pushes the boy on the issue.
I made the big wish then. I wish it was never knocked down. I wish real hard. It was magic, Boley.
Henry's wish coming true here was foreshadowed earlier in the episode by his mother. She mentioned a similar unlikely occurrence stemming from another one of her son's big tall wishes. But at this moment, Boley refuses to believe it. He thinks the boy needs to be given the hard truth about the real world.
Listen, kid, I've been wishing all my life. I got a gut ache from wishing, and all I got to show for it is a face full of scars. You trying to tell me you wished me into a knockout? You trying to tell me it was magic that made me get up off my back?
If you don't believe, Boley, it won't be true. That's the way magic works.
They're back and forth concerning the idealistic, faithful attitude of a child and the worn-down but realistic outlook of an adult is heartbreaking to see from both sides.
I can't believe. I'm too old. And I'm too hurt to believe.
They cry together, trying to convince the other of their ideology when we fade back to the fight. Boley is back on the ground and is counted out, losing the bout. We see after that, his hand is again broken, as he takes a walk of shame this time back to his building. Once there, he shares another very sweet scene with Henry, but this time, it's very different.
I ain't gonna make no more wishes, Boley. I'm too old for wishes.
Maybe there is magic, and maybe there's wishes, too. I guess the trouble is there's not enough people around to believe.
Wishing for something hard enough until it comes true is what we saw happen in the 16mm Shrine, but that was a very different story with a different moral. I personally connect with some of what this episode is saying much better. Rod Serling's ending narration is another great one. It's too long to play all the way through, so I'll read it for you. Mr. Boley Jackson, 183 pounds, who left a second chance lying in a heap on a rosin-splattered canvas at St. Nick's Arena. Mr. Boley Jackson, who shares the most common ailment of all men, the strange and perverse disinclination to believe in a miracle. The kind of miracle to come from the mind of a little boy. Honestly, I think that narration is a little too hard on our main character. In a lot of ways, Boley's right. You can't just generically wish something into existence, but that doesn't mean you have to be closed-minded to miracles. We have to work hard to make our dreams a reality, and it's a good lesson for little Henry to learn. The world's not fair, no matter how hard we wish it was. Bad things happen to good people, and we don't always get back what we put in. Conversely, we shouldn't be so world-weary that we close our eyes to the miracles that happen every day. It's a cliche, but it's true. The simple stuff is what we should cherish. We're here. We're alive. You're watching this video about an incredible show that we share a love for. It's something that's touched us in some way, and there's a joy in that we need to hold on to. Those are the aspects of life that we can't lose sight of. In some ways, it's similar to the faith of a child. It all comes down to perspective, which can be pretty easy to lose when things constantly don't go our way. Life takes more than it gives, but the fact that it happened in the first place is what we need to celebrate. Whether it be working hard to achieve a dream or a big tall wish, some things are universal, even in the Twilight Zone. I'm a fan of A Nice Place to Visit. I actually consider it one of the more haunting, entertaining episodes of the first season. It all hinges on the ending twist, and sure, it's a predictable finish to the episode, but I thought the execution of it was well done. Larry Blyden, and especially Sebastian Cabot, turned in a pair of memorable performances. This was the last episode written by Charles Beaumont in Season 1, and also the last that John Brom directed until Season 2's Mr. Dingle the Strong. A modern comparison one could make to what happens in this episode would be the hit NBC series The Good Place. Heck, the original title of this episode was The Other Place. Henry Francis Rocky Valentine is a lifelong criminal. After robbing his latest target, a pawn shop, he's chased by police and shot dead trying to get away. But that's where this story begins. A plump man dressed in all white wakes him up and informs him of his new reality. This is Pip. He's Rocky's guide in the afterlife, and slowly, the criminal sees that he now has access to everything he's ever wanted. Valentine dives headfirst into his fantasies, but even after all his dreams come true, he's left wondering how he came to be in a place that's giving him everything he wants when he's admittedly led a terrible life. Larry Blyden as Rocky Valentine isn't given the opportunity to do anything too deep with this portrayal, but he does have a few contemplative moments, and is absolutely fun to watch.
I must be in heaven. Yeah, that's it. That's it, I'm in heaven, right?
Interestingly, Mickey Rooney was supposed to play the role of Valentine, but wasn't available. Writer Charles Beaumont's requested backup was actually Rod Serling himself. He turned it down and brought in Blyden instead, but could you imagine? Could Rod have pulled off this type of role? He did act a couple times throughout his career, but I'm not convinced this would have been a good fit for him. But what do you guys think? That would have made for a very amusing narration, wouldn't it have? I mean, they would have had to have acknowledged it in some capacity, right? As for Mickey Rooney, he would pop up in more of Serling's work outside of just his Season 5 episode of The Twilight Zone. He had a large role in the film version of the Rod Serling written Requiem for a Heavyweight. Would he have worked here as Valentine? Probably. It would have been a very different role if Rooney had taken it, but at the end of the day, I'm pretty satisfied with Blyden's performance in the final product. Sebastian Cabot as Pip is the best thing about the episode. He's so jolly and eager to help his new tenant. Being an otherworldly presence, he pops up whenever Rocky needs him to answer any questions or explain how the space they're in works.
My name is Pip. Can I help you?
How do you know my name?
It's my job to know everything about you.
Cabot was convinced to bleach his hair white for this part. It was a tough decision since he was known for his dark mane and beard. It took 3 months for his natural look to return, but I do think the lighter hair helps for this character. In combination with his white suit and jovial attitude, Pip needed to look this way for the story to work in the end. Although, maybe they could have just given him a wig. Guess that wasn't an option. The look of this episode is a bit above average. We do get a few vastly different locations to fill scenes with, ranging from the dark street Valentine is killed on to the extravagant room he stays in after. Even the large casino set, complete with the same slot machine prop used in The Fever, gives Valentine's heaven a bigger scale. But the best looking part of the episode is when he travels to the massive Hall of Records with Pip. These are the same steps used in Time Enough at Last, and the way they're shown off here, with file cabinets of information about Rocky at the top of them, present an effective divine look that helps us buy into this world a bit more. That scene is also important, as Valentine searches for the reason he was brought to such a nice plane of existence in the first place. He fails to find a redeeming quality here, and you can tell that bothers him.
You don't think it'd be some mistake, do you?
Not likely.
I can't figure it.
Valentine has been dead for a month and is catching on to the fact that no matter what he does, he's not satisfied. He wins every time he plays in the casino, has multiple beautiful women at his side at every moment, and the thrill of everything is already gone. When he confronts Pip about this, he is adamant that he doesn't belong in heaven, that he wants to go to the other place.
Whatever gave you the idea you were in heaven, Mr. Valentine? This is the other place.
As you've probably guessed, Valentine has been in hell from the beginning. It's not the most unpredictable thing to happen in this series, but I love it. Too much of a good thing, or in this case, too much of all the good things, end up being a personal hell for this character. But I think it would look different depending on the person.
I thought this was only for, like, school teachers and like that.
Oh, we have some school teachers here.
Yeah, I might know a few of those. Cabot can be borderline sweet in his role as Pip before this reveal, which twists the knife even more. On the whole, I enjoy the hell out of this episode, pun intended. It's not exactly one of those that gets under your skin, but it did make me think about what one's ideal version of heaven would be like. As humans, we'd inevitably get tired of perfection, so what can we hope for in the great beyond, if you are a quote-unquote believer? Maybe it's something we can't comprehend at this stage, but in any case, a nice place to visit describes somewhere we wouldn't want to live. In this case, that place is the Twilight Zone. Nightmare as a Child had the potential to be a stronger installment of the show, but as is, it only does a passable job of telling this story. A few scenes land decently well, but I think this is one of those ideas that sounded better in the pre-production phase. Nonetheless, it does have a few memorable moments. School teacher Helen Foley returns home from a day at work to find a little girl waiting for her outside her apartment. She invites her in for a cup of hot chocolate, and things start to take a turn for the anomalous. The girl's name is Marky, and through her eerie disposition, she begins to divulge information about Helen's background and thoughts that only Helen would know. This includes earlier that same day when she locked eyes with a man she thought looked familiar but could not place. Marky leaves when that same man arrives at Helen's door. His connection to her past, in combination with Marky's mysterious appearances, have Helen questioning her own mental state as a traumatic childhood experience is brought to the forefront. Terry Burnham as Little Marky is pretty straightforward with her enigmatic dialogue. She's a bit creepy and does a decent enough job for a 10-year-old.
You got burnt once. That scar right below your elbow.
Janice Rule as Helen is kind of spotty for me. There are some lines and moments delivered believably, but others where there seemed to be a disconnect from the material or direction.
I'm kind of an expert on children. Quiet ones, noisy ones, all kinds. I teach school. Of course I remember.
How did it happen?
Well, actually I don't remember.
It's not really a good sign when the most compelling fact about this character is that she was named after one of Rod Serling's favorite high school teachers. As the story moves along, we meet Peter Selden, unsettlingly played by Shepard Strudwick. Helen saw him earlier that day, and slowly we find out that he used to work for her mother. Helen's mom was killed when she was just a little girl. As the conversation continues, Selden mentions that he even knew Helen around that time.
Well, it's wonderful to see you grown up the way you have. Just as beautiful as you were when you were a little girl. I had quite a crush on you. I lived in the same apartment building.
Yeah, I'm not sure if having a crush on someone meant something different in the early 1960s, but that is all kinds of gross. He blatantly says she was a little girl when he worked for her mom. That would make him an adult at the time. Strudwick was 24 years older than Rule. Is that supposed to make him creepier? I can't tell if that was intended or not, but it doesn't quite look like a red flag for the Helen character, so that was just odd. Strudwick does slowly show more of a threatening side as their chat turns more serious and provides more details on the murder of Helen's mother. After telling Helen he was the first person to find her mother the night she died, he reveals he's kept a picture of Foley as a child, because that's a regular thing people do, but the picture looks just like Marky. Peter even says Marky was Helen's nickname when she was a kid. Helen then has a flashback to the night of the murder, where we see what happened in shadow. Helen's been blocking these memories for years, and they're all just now flooding back to her. Marky appears again and tells her the truth we all probably guessed at this point.
I'm you, Helen. Understand now? I'm you. I'm you when you were 10 years old.
If you didn't get it, they made sure to spell it out because this little girl goes on to mention every detail of that fateful night.
When you lived with your mother in the apartment house. I'm you when you were asleep with Mother downstairs, and she tried to get away, and she ran into your room, and a man caught her. Then he picked up something heavy, and he hit her on the head. Then you screamed so loud, Helen.
When Helen turns back around, Peter is still there. He can see it's all coming back to her, so he tells her the chilling truth.
That night, it was me in your bedroom. I killed your mother.
The guy who acted like a creep the entire time he was on screen turned out to not be a good guy. Shocking, I know. Apparently, he had messed with the books at their job, and when Helen's mom was going to inform on him, he killed her. The only reason Helen didn't suffer the same fate that night was because her screams brought people to the scene of the crime. All these years later, he's been following her in case her blocked-out memory ever returned to implicate him. Now that it has, Selden plans to kill her too. Helen runs and a scuffle ensues. It ends when she pushes him down a large flight of stairs to his death. This was actually a really good stunt, even if the double's face is plainly visible. The child version of Helen was a manifestation of her blocked memory that was trying to claw its way to the surface after she saw Peter on the street earlier that day. The episode ends with Helen seeing a different little girl outside her apartment and finally able to move past a traumatic event that dominated her entire life, consciously and unconsciously. There's nothing really sci-fi or supernatural about the ending twist, which makes this a bit of a rarity. The episode has a few decent sequences, but overall, I'd say this is a skippable episode. Everything felt very flat in just the one location, and the story presentation wasn't really interesting enough to draw me in for the full 25-minute duration. Director Alvin Ganzer is 2 for 3 in my book when it comes to these rewatches. If you want to see his better work, check out What You Need, or the classic Hitchhiker episode. Nightmare as a child is more of a forgettable daydream that you can leave in the Twilight Zone. A Stop at Willoughby draws a lot of comparisons to the earlier episode, Walking Distance. They're very different by the time you get to the end, but the basic setup is similar, complete with the overworked main character and desire to find an easygoing paradise where someone can get away from the pressures of everyday adult life. This installment was a favorite of a lot of the production team, including producer Buck Houghton and Rod Serling himself. I can see why. It really is a well-conceived and executed story with great performances from the handful of actors that are focused on. Unlike the melancholy but ultimately positive tone of Walking Distance, A Stop at Willoughby gives us a darker angle on a similar story. Garth Williams is a man looking for a break. His high-stakes job at an ad agency comes equipped with a highly volatile and demanding boss, while his home life consists of a spiteful wife who's pushed him down a path he never wanted to travel in the first place. On his way home from work one snowy November evening, he falls asleep on his regular train and awakens in another place, another time. It's July of 1888, and the train has arrived at a stop named Willoughby. It's a picturesque little village where a man can supposedly slow down and live his life full measure. Confused, Williams wakes up. It was just a dream. But this dream repeats several times over the next few days as Willoughby looks more and more attractive to him. With the demands of his job and marriage weighing heavier on him by the moment, Garth increasingly thinks of what it might be like to slow down and retreat to this charming small town to escape the torments of his daily life. This was the second of 3 episodes Robert Parrish directed for the series, and it may be the most lauded by critics and fans of the show. Although One for the Angels is well remembered because of Ed Wynn's performance and the sweet nature of its plot, A Stop at Willoughby is definitely a story closer to the standard mood most Twilight Zone episodes are recollected for. That is, weird, dark, and thought-provoking. Parrish's use of close-ups at the beginning of the show pushed the anxiety element that is essential for our main character to feel. In contrast, when he's wistfully imagining his ideal life in Willoughby, the camera moves in a more delicate manner, as if to suggest he's in the calm, serene environment that he's describing. There's no doubt Serling put a lot of himself into this character. Dealing with ad agencies and sponsorship teams was a consistent part of his job on this show and across his career. It's something he was outspoken about, hating to deal with. Garth's job is shown as a place of relentless onward marching, and his boss encapsulates that attitude.
Push, Williams. Push, Williams. Push, Williams. Get with it, boy. Push, Williams.
We definitely have sympathy for this guy right away, as he's kicked around by his boss and wife. James Daly's acting hits that target, but in contrast to someone like Henry Bemis in Time Enough at Last, Garth Williams isn't afraid to speak up and defend himself. He can clearly state what he wants and how upset he is with his current situation, whether it be articulately or otherwise.
It's push all the way, all the time, right on down the line.
Fat boy, why don't you shut your mouth?
Any job at all where I could be myself, where I wouldn't have to climb on a stage and go through a masquerade every morning at 9 o'clock and mouth all the dialogue and play the executive. Because I'm not that person, Janie.
While he's not exactly a pushover, Williams does seem hopelessly obligated to his role as an ad executive and husband.
I'm sick, and I'm tired of a husband who lives in a kind of permanent self-pity.
Patricia Donahue plays the role of Garth's wife perfectly. She's condescending, apathetic, and just plain mean. Her performance is the perfect way to show there's no respite for Williams anywhere in his life. The times Garth is transported to Willoughby totally changed the look and tone of the episode. A tranquil mood pervades the air. He's the only passenger on this 1888 train, and his worries seem far away from him.
Willoughby. July. Summer. It's 1888. Peaceful. Restful. Where a man can slow down to a walk and live his life full measure.
You can tell right away there's something off about that conductor. I don't know if I would trust that guy like Garth seems to, but that's all part of the surreal nature of this very realistic dream world. Willoughby doesn't exist on any map. In fact, it never did. When Williams finds this out, he sees it as his mind creating a perfect place for him to get away from his troubles. But every time he's about to get off the train and enjoy the village, he wakes up back in the real world. Later, he describes Willoughby to his wife, and you can just see the peace on his face.
I've never seen such serenity. It was the way people must have lived 100 years ago.
It's also great how his wife throws it back in his face right after.
My miserable, tragic error to get married to a man whose big dream in life is to be huckleberry thin.
During an especially stressful day at work where he's being pulled in multiple different directions at the same time, Garth starts to lose it. As a last-ditch effort, he calls his wife to try and find some kind of comfort, but she hangs up on him, leaving him all alone. Williams falls asleep once again on his way home, but this time actually gets off the train and steps into Willoughby, intending to stay. In reality, Garth jumped off the moving train and died instantly. He was said to have screamed Willoughby as he leapt to his death. A funeral home company then arrives to pick up his body. The name on the back of the car reads, Willoughby & Son Funeral Home. We see images of the village as Serling's poignant narration ends the episode. This was quite the double twist. Garth's apparent suicide and the name of the funeral home company give it a very dark tinge, but Williams seems happy the last time we see him. Was this a supernatural freeing of his burdened soul, or the tragic death of a man who couldn't live one more day in his unforgiving unhappiness? It's a heavy theme. Suicide is something a lot of us have been affected by one way or another, and while I don't necessarily think it's dangerous to present the ending of this story as a safe release into forever happiness, I do see this more as a tragedy than a victory for Garth Williams. It goes to show you that any one person just willing to listen to someone as depressed as this character was could make all the difference. This is exemplified by his wife abandoning him when Williams is hanging on the edge. It's a sad story, but it made for a great episode. There are nice little touches put in there that I didn't notice on the first viewing, like the band playing Beautiful Dreamer as Garth enters the town, or the mention of a Bradbury account at Williams' job, a nice wink to author Ray Bradbury, whose complicated history with the Twilight Zone is a long story for another time. I also love the shot of Willoughby's grandfather clock swinging into a dissolve of the lantern waving, signaling Williams' demise. I still don't like that conductor. It seems to me he was actively trying to entice Garth into his suicide. Whether it be symbolic or not, that character creeps me out. I'm really interested to hear what you guys think of this episode and how you interpret its ending. Personally, since so many people love comparing it to Walking Distance, I'll say that I like that episode more. It was more interesting to me with better visuals, music, direction, and acting. But A Stop at Willoughby is a high-quality episode, which reminds us that sometimes death can look like a dream in the Twilight Zone. We've come to the big finale, folks. This is the last episode we're covering for October 2020, so happy Halloween. I'm just a bit sad we have to end things with a subpar episode like The Chaser. It's a pretty basic love potion story, but it's not without some admirable behind-the-scenes production techniques, and John McIntyre's portrayal of Professor A. Damon is pretty good, so not a total loss. This was actually the only episode of the first season not written by Rod Serling, Charles Beaumont, or Richard Matheson. No, this was written by Robert Prenzel Jr., his only credit for the whole show, and was adapted from the short story of the same name by John Henry Collier. According to Mark Zickry's The Twilight Zone companion book, the script was originally written for and performed live on the Billy Rose Television Theater in 1951. I found some information on Billy Rose, but next to nothing about his television theater show. In any case, that could explain why this isn't quite up to snuff. Maybe it just didn't translate well and not enough was changed. Mainstay Douglas Hayes directed, but even his talents couldn't quite save most of this episode. A young man named Roger Shackelforth is obsessed with an uninterested woman named Leela. When we meet him, he's continuously calling her from a payphone to profess his love. However, he's been trying to get through for quite a while and a line has formed behind him. Trying to get Shackelforth out of the booth, a man gives him a card to go see someone who can help with his romantic issue. This brings Roger to the residence of the irritable Professor A. Damon. He reluctantly sells Roger a love potion for $1. Shackelforth is supposed to put it in Leela's drink, and like magic, she will fall madly, hopelessly in love with him. And after some convincing to get into her house and share some champagne, that's exactly what happens. We then jump ahead to see they've been married for 6 months. Roger has grown tired of constantly being showered with affection and returns to the professor, possibly seeking another much more expensive liquid Damon calls glove cleaner. So Roger is,
I must see you, darling, must. Furiously, fiercely must!
A little...
Just spare me 5 minutes and have one drink with me. I love you.
Ew. Horrible person. He's a terrible, horrible person. I realize the love potion story was a trope used in a ton of movies and series back then, and even to this day in some form, but this one is noteworthy because of what happens at the end, which we'll get to. The one significant saving grace of this episode is the Professor A. Damon character, played very well by John McIntyre. He's great in every scene he's in.
Toxins, tonics, antitoxins, decoctions, concoctions, and potions. All guaranteed.
His name's not exactly subtle, but the performance is pretty awesome, as is the library lair in his house. Director Douglas Hayes said that set nearly doubled the budget of the episode, but producer Buck Houghton got the money to make it happen. When they first open the door to Damon's home, we see a door in the distance that's supposed to look far back. It's actually a smaller door to trick the eye, and it works pretty well. When Roger steps inside to open the door, Hayes wanted to have one big reveal shot where he could bring the camera in on a crane and show the vastness of the room. To achieve this, they actually moved the walls apart as the doors opened so the crane could fit through. It's an impressive shot, and the whole set looks great. They lit it partially from behind the bookcases to give it a kind of unnatural glow. So Roger gets the love potion, gives it to Leela, and it works.
What's happening?
What difference? Come here, baby.
Just a reminder, this is literally right before that.
Please go. Now. I don't want you here. I don't even like you at the moment. Now please go.
Yeah, that hasn't aged well. They jump ahead right away to 6 months after their wedding, and he's already sick of her. I thought we'd get a scene or two to build up to that, but it doesn't happen. From there, it's right back to Damon's place, where things get pretty dark. The glove cleaner mentioned earlier is actually a poison meant to painlessly kill someone without a trace of foul play. After a few minutes, Damon convinces Roger to make the purchase, something he seemed to already be willing to do since he had a $1,000 check made out and ready to hand over. Damon is especially devious in this scene.
Always the same way. First the stimulant, then the chaser.
Roger returns home, ready to give her the poison. He puts it in another champagne glass when Leela reveals something unexpected.
I've got news for you, sweet little rabbit.
Rabbit.
Yes, Leela is pregnant. Roger tells himself he wouldn't have gone through with it anyway, and he faints upon hearing his wife say this is just the beginning of their life together. We then end with Damon being seen smoking a cigar on their balcony. He puffs the shape of a heart and fades away. Honestly, it wasn't until this last rewatch that I realized the glove cleaner was poison meant to kill Leela. I'm so used to the love potion antidote trope that dark detail went right over my head before. That also makes Roger an even worse person for being willing to kill his wife. If they wanted to go down an even darker route, they could have had him kill her and find out she was pregnant after. I could see that fitting into a more serious Twilight Zone episode, but this one definitely had a lighter tone. It wouldn't have worked with the way the story was presented to us. The original short story was just dialogue between what would be the Damon and Roger characters in the episode. I read it, and it works much better in that abbreviated context. Overall, this episode has some fun stuff about it, but it's definitely not one I would go out of my way to track down. George Grizzard would pop up in a better episode down the line, and Douglas Hayes would direct far superior installments going forward. And that's it for Twilight-Tober Zone. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. It was a whole ton of work. We'll have to see if we can do it again next year because I love talking about the Twilight Zone. And if you watched some of these videos and are interested in checking out the show, I couldn't recommend it more. Big shout out to Mark Zickry's The Twilight Zone companion book for being a constant source of great information. The Blu-ray set also had some phenomenal behind-the-scenes interviews and commentaries. If you're a big fan of the show, it's worth getting. Make sure you guys check out my personal YouTube channel where I may review some Twilight Zone related content coming up soon. Also, follow me on Twitter and Facebook so we can discuss more about this series. I love getting to talk about these episodes, so don't hesitate to stop on by and start a conversation. Until next time, this is Walter Benasiak saying Happy Halloween from the Twilight-Tober Zone.